So I'm going to be throwing this debate happened last night for review. It's Stratton versus White on Molinism. Is Molinism biblical? Feel free to join me though. Talk about whatever. Hopefully it won't get shut down here. All credit to Lutheran United, whatever it is, church channel. I'll post it in the link in the description.
I mean, they are brothers, and they could be brothers. So, both speakers are going to be using this somewhat antiquated screen here. So I'm going to be turning off a few lights. So don't be startled when that happens. And there's going to be some transition between each time for speaking. We will have a brief reception afterwards if you want to meet the speakers, but I'm going to say in advance, please keep your time very short in respecting of a very travel-weary, debate-prepared speakers tonight. But it'll be in the education building next door. Best way to get there, go out the door you came in, walk around to either door to the education building behind the large magnolia tree. Reasonable Faith will have a table in the room far that way down the hall. Accordance Software will have a table and books in the room closer this way in the education building. I also work with a group called Theology on Tap, so there's some material there if you want to pick it up. If you like theological debate, conversation, it's every other month. Less formal than this, but still fun. So if you're in Houston and you want to come out for that, grab a brochure for that. Our format should be in the program, but 20 minutes opening remarks for each speaker. Dr. Stratton's going to go first because he's answering in the affirmative on the question, is Molinism biblical? 8-minute rebuttals each. There'll be 40 minutes of cross-examination total. That's 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes. 5-minute closings, then we're going to have 20 minutes approximately for Q&A. We're not going to get to all of the questions, so if I don't choose yours, it's nothing personal. Probably I'm going to go for the most legible. So if you want your question answered, it needs to be readable. And I'm going to go back and forth between each speaker. I would ask the speaker to give about a 1-minute answer with about a 30-second rejoinder. I'm going to pick those up. This is for my volunteers as well. I'm going to pick those up after the second 10-minute cross-examination. That'll give me about 30 minutes to find good questions. So if you have a question going in, go ahead and feel free to write it down. We'll pick those up in the middle, right in the middle of the cross-examination section. With those formalities behind us, as both of our speakers are Christian, that's not always the case in a debate, but it is the case tonight, I would like to offer a word of prayer. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks that we can gather in freedom to consider your glory and might, your nature and will. Give us humility to learn that we might know you better, serve you better, and work together to bring about a better world. Bless our speakers, James and Timothy, and our audience, that the truth would be magnified and that truth would lead us to you. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. I would ask our first speaker, Dr. Stratton, to come forward at this time. You may welcome.
Good evening. To everyone watching this debate, thank you for taking theology so seriously. And to Dr. James White, it's an honor to have this conversation with you. Thank you, sir. Well, James and I disagree on tonight's topic, but we have two things in common. We are brothers in Christ, and we never have a bad hair day. Well, although this is an in-house debate, Outsiders, as Paul refers to them in Colossians 4:5, are watching closely. If White's view of God prevails, atheists are justified in their non-belief. This is because, in White's view, God is not merely the author of evil, but he causes and determines every single evil thought and action. Yes, on White's view, God actually makes evil happen by way of cause and effect. This leads to what is known as the problem of evil, the greatest objection raised against the knowledge of God. If Molinism is true, however, the problems of evil are defeated. So, this debate matters. Let's get down to business. Is Molinism biblical? Before answering that question, what does it mean for a doctrine to be biblical? As James has written, the only folks who are truly biblical are those who believe all the Bible has to say on a given topic. Obviously, a doctrine can be explicitly taught in Scripture. However, doctrines can also be inferred from the biblical data if, one, the doctrine is consistent with and does not contradict Scripture, and two, the biblical data supports the core tenets of the doctrine. Since we're examining Scripture to find logical contradictions, we must presuppose logic and the rules of reason before examining the text. By assuming logic and reason, we can infer truths about God that are not explicitly taught in Scripture. An example of this is the Trinity. The Trinity, while not explicitly taught in Scripture, is both consistent with the whole of Scripture and backed by the biblical data around God's nature, such as the divinity of Christ, the divinity of the Holy Spirit, and how they share the attributes of God. In this sense, although the word Trinity is found nowhere in Scripture, the concept of the Trinity is biblical. For similar reasons, if the Trinity is biblical, then Molinism is biblical. What is meant by Molinism? It's the conjunction of propositions. God possesses middle knowledge and humans possess libertarian freedom. What's middle knowledge? According to Kirk McGregor, it's simply God's knowledge of all things that would happen in every possible set of circumstances an omnipotent God could create. What's libertarian freedom? It refers to a person's choice, action, evaluation, or judgment that is not causally determined by something or someone else. Tyson James puts it this way: libertarian freedom is the ability to choose such that antecedent conditions are insufficient to causally determine one's choice. These definitions of libertarian freedom hold whether or not there are alternative possibilities. However, if one does possess opportunities to choose among alternative possibilities in the real world, then one is not determined by something or someone else. With biblical data in mind, we can also understand libertarian freedom in this manner: the opportunity to exercise an ability to choose between at least two options, each of which.
Hey, have you seen this? What's up, man?
Hey, what's going on? No, I have not seen this actually. Hold on, I don't like my avatar real quick. Let me change that. No. Okay, I think I'm gonna go with. I think I'm gonna go traditional with Colby.
Yeah, I like that one. All right. Yeah, this happened last night at the First United Lutheran Houston on their channel. White versus Stratton from, I think, William Lane Craig's ministry, maybe. He's defending Molinism. It's pretty good. I haven't seen the entire thing, but he gets into some good stuff here.
I think, like, how should I say this? I think it's ridiculous to kind of argue for Molinism or Calvinism because passages a Calvinist will go into support Calvinism, passages that support Molinism, and they're both present within the scriptures. What's going on is that, like, I think at some point people have to admit that God's foreknowledge is a subject that is too advanced for one position to be right, okay? Like, for instance, James White is essentially someone that believes in divine determinism. And, there are passages in the Bible where you can get that from God, where everything seems to be already have been preordained, or rather pre-decreed by God himself. But there are equally a number of passages in the Bible where man evidently has free will, the free will to decide apart from the decree of God. So there is, so both sides are represented very thoroughly within the Bible. And that's why I do not identify as Molinist or Calvinist or any position of God's foreknowledge. I think I take the best from all the views, whether it's Calvinism, Molinism, Thomism, even a little bit of open theism, things like that. Because all of these philosophies, all these views, they have their strengths and weaknesses. So what's best is to take a little bit out of each and don't limit yourself to one or the other. And I think that's what Stratton and White are practically like exhibits of having done.
Yes, I think that's a good way to look at it. I think the issue is you run into problems with a single view, it is interesting that I do recall Stratton makes his argument for Molinism being biblical while being a Calvinist and maybe a weaker form than James White, but he makes an argument in an attempt to say that mere Molinism, which is something he has written about, is in his child or whatever, argues that it's just a biblical concept that you can take on as a Calvinist. So that's kind of interesting too. And they kind of argue back and forth about that, but
right. And that's actually that's because Calvinism in and of itself doesn't just how should I say? It doesn't just what's the word? It doesn't just obsess itself by the foreknowledge of God. Believing in a Calvinist foreknowledge of God doesn't make you a Calvinist, whether because there are more doctrines with Calvinism than just the foreknowledge of God. Oftentimes, Calvinism makes claims about the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. It also makes claims about baptism, other things. So Calvinism is more robust than just an understanding that, like, God is essentially a determinist programmer.
yeah, that's definitely true. There's other things going on there. I would tend to use like a reformed view, but although I prefer to not.
Reform would be the better word. Thank you, Jamie.
The reason though I don't is because almost everyone would understand me to be saying like tulip, but I want to take back and say I'm reformed as well, because although I do all the different soteriology than many of the reformers did, Wesley has to be called a reformer, I think, or a child of it, and he's not a determinist. So determinism seems to be what binds them all together classically, what we call Calvinism today. But you're right. I mean, the Presbyterians, there's people have different views on baptism, etc. So that's
like for instance, you might not like Ryan, but Ryan is not a determinist, where say James White is, and yet they're both Calvinist. That's because where James White falls on the spectrum of Christianity, Ryan would fall all but in the same manner, except that he isn't hyper-determinist. That's really the difference. But as far as like the Lord's Supper, like for instance, both he and White confirm the Westminster Confession of Faith. That is a very, very Calvinist document, and it doesn't just obsess itself with God's foreknowledge, but it talks about other things regarding Christian doctrine. Like for instance, and this is what I mean. I don't think you could how should I say this? Consistently call yourself reformed when you read that, plus even tulip. For instance, do you believe in total depravity?
No.
Exactly, because I don't either. Because what total depravity is, it is the idea that man has been corrupted so profoundly so profoundly that he is a ruined creation in and of itself. I reject that, because essentially what's going on is that Calvinism believes that you are basically evil with the ability to do good, whereas the Catholic understanding is the exact opposite. We're basically good with the ability to do evil. We're kind of like we're kind of broken creations, not so much that we are evil as much as we are broken. And so when we try to we by our nature try to do good, and the problem is we try to do good without God, who we were meant to do good by and through. And so therefore the good we attempt to do simply becomes evil. It's a lot like being Superman that can't fly.
Yeah, I think I can agree with that. I would probably, I shied away a little bit from when you said we're good with, I guess that maybe I'm a little more in line with the Reformed in my thinking, but if I'm honest, I think I have to say I can take that totally on fine, the idea that we're good in a certain sense, right? But we are intrinsic. I do believe we're fallen, of course, and we have a tendency for sin, but I do think we're free.
Exactly, because well, again, I know the church does not disagree that we are broken creations, right? We're just not ruined creations. And so
Yes.
what's going on is that, and again, you can go to Thomas Aquinas on this. He says he speaks explicitly on this issue that there's not a single person that goes about their life intending to do evil. Let's look at Satan. Satan would not be doing what he's doing to God's people and to God himself if he didn't think there was some good he could achieve for himself. And similarly put, when Adolf Hitler just slaughtered like 12 million people among those 6 million Jews, he didn't do this with the intent of like just being being an evil bastard. That's not like him, or that's not like people even. Rather, what he was doing what he deemed to be good for the German state and for the German race. That's what he was doing. So when he was killing these people, he didn't see them as people. He saw himself as more or less pulling weeds out from those corrupting factors of his perfect German race and new Reich. Because what he was trying to do, he was trying to create a new Rome. And in order to create a new Rome, you need to root out the weak. And so he saw himself as doing that. And in a way, he saw this as a good for them, because living the life of a weakling is a terrible life to live in his estimation. And so even when Hitler was doing things that we know are absolutely heinous, deplorable, and despicable, in Hitler's perspective, he's simply pursuing his own good. And that's what I mean, that when man tries to achieve good by himself apart from God, that good is actually something evil, but we don't intend for the evil. It just comes by the natural state of our brokenness. That's why we need God, because only God is good, and all goodness emanates and comes from God. And so with God, we are able to commit that which is good.
Yeah, and I think people might be shocked that Hitler probably fed his dogs and took his mother, kissed his mother, and loved people.
Yeah, like
I'm not sticking up for him. I'm just merely saying that
he's a human being.
Yeah, and he probably had lots of good intention and a lot of hate and stuff too. I just mean to say that, like, I think part of the problem is if you jettison the notion that people have the status of imagers of God, you could think all sorts of evil was good in order for the future of the human race and etc.
Yeah. Think of it like this. Do you kind of freak out when you see a rat scurrying around in your house?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah, well, that's how Hitler saw kind of the Jews and the people he was exterminating as kind of lesser than, as weaker. Not so much that he hates them, so to speak, but as much as he looks at them as the weak. He, being the strong, has the obligation to remove them and is simply acting in the way that nature has given him authority to act like. For instance, like he was also a Darwinist. He believed in survival of the fittest. The German people were fit to survive. The fact that he was killing Jews and the minorities left and right rather proved his point that due to no other virtue except for their weakness, they had the they had the expectation that they were to die, because like in virtue of their weakness as compared to the strength of the German people, they were kind of measured in the scales and found wanting in Hitler's view, and therefore you can just properly throw these people away. They are like they are the less thans.
Do you think the Bible had anything to do with that? I mean,
I do not, because this is a fundamental rejection, not just of the Bible, but of Christianity itself, because there are two principles in which Christianity is founded on. It's the idea that the weak have a certain dignity, of value, and that there is no Jew or Greek, that all people are equal under the weight of sin and under God. Both these principles were fundamentally rejected by Hitler. Now, even if he had used Christian imagery as a way of propagating his fascism, it nonetheless was a direct rejection of Christianity on the most fundamental levels.
I agree. I suspect that those kinds of things were more of like appropriated for the I don't know what you'd call it, for the the population that could be manipulated, let's say. But there is a question in my mind, though, that like also it could be just like a failure to understand principles in the Bible, and then read the New Testament and think, oh, these people killed the Messiah. You know what I mean? Like that's in the back of my head, but I agree. Like if understood properly, the Bible is totally like the teachings of Christ are going to say no, to that, obviously. But yeah, that does haunt me a little bit, like to wonder. But I suspect it was more.
Yeah, hey, bud, don't let it haunt you. The enemies of Christ want. How to put it? It's in vogue now to call things you don't like Nazism. Like, as I said,
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, because I hold the views that I do of secular governments and how a proper one is supposed to act in a Christian society, I have literally been called a fascist and a Nazi. Despite my fact my views are utterly irreconcilable with fascism, like people can't be expected to be smart. But getting back on the topic here, what is going on with Hitler? Like, how to put it? Have you seen the news regarding Whoopi Goldberg?
No, I was wondering what it was about. I saw.
Okay. So basically, Whoopi Goldberg exposed that she is an anti-Semite because on The View, when she was talking about the Holocaust, she said the Holocaust wasn't about race because it was a group of white people slaughtering another group of white people because the biggest group of the victims were in fact Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, which essentially translates to European Jews. And so because she sees a bunch of pasty white guys are killing a bunch of pasty white guys.
You white guys all look the same.
Exactly. No, that's literally her because she's an American. And how do I want to say? To be an American, I think, is to be ignorant because when you're because here's the thing. When you're a world power, you have the privilege of imposing your understanding of the world on others that don't have it. And so here in America, race is literally divided between white and black. You're either colored or you're not. This doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Like when you go, when you go to when you go to Poland and you ask a normal Polish citizen, "Hey, are you white?" They're gonna grow a third, fourth, and fifth eye looking at you because they don't see themselves as white. They see themselves as Polish, and they make a distinction between Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, not Uzbek, it's far off to the east, but like Lithuanian. These distinctions, these nationalities, these races exist. These ethnicities exist. Like Poland is every bit as diverse as the world's people are, or rather, sorry, Europe is as diverse as the world's people are. They don't see themselves as white guys. They see themselves as Spanish, French, Italian, German, Polish, English. Like even in the UK, you have Irish, you have Welsh, you have English, you have like Scottish. These are not the same people. Like if you go to like Ireland and you just say, well, you and the English are basically the same people. My God, those are fighting words. You will get your ass kicked right in that country because
Yeah.
because to this day there is a kind of knee-jerk hateful reaction between England and Ireland because of the history between the two countries. But in either case, though, what Whoopi Goldberg was doing, she was exposing herself as an anti-Semite because she has a very American view of what race is, and it isn't compatible with the rest of the world. But in any case, what's going on is that there was a comic book that was published in the late 90s, and it is a true story about a man's grandfather that had survived the Holocaust. And so this man wanted his grandfather's story to be told to much younger generations, basically around a middle high school age. And the comic series was called Mouse, Maus. I fully recommend, Jamie, you actually read this comic. It's amazing, in fact. But so what's going on is that in order to sell a Holocaust story to children, the Jews are essentially like pictured as mice, and the Germans are pictured as cats. So cats are literally killing mice. And I find that as very fitting because no doubt that's how the Germans saw themselves in those times, where they were kind of the superior race, in this case cats, and they had the duty, or rather the ability, to kill mice, and they simply saw themselves as fulfilling nature's obligation. So I rather like how that comic portrays this disparity, because no doubt this is how German fascists would have seen themselves. And so
Yeah, I'm definitely interested. Send it to me, or I'll be emailing you here in the next day.
no, dude, just go in like to Amazon Prime, type in MAUS, because Whoopi Goldberg brought this up. Because here's the thing: the context is there is an entire school district that banned this book from being read. Now Whoopi Goldberg kind of makes her hot take on that, reveals she's an anti-Semite, and the book essentially shoots up to one of the most popular search titles on Amazon. So just go to Amazon, type in
I did see that. Yeah.
yeah, just type in MAUS, you'll find it. It's an easy read.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do that. Hey, let me, Kelby, what's up, man? What drew you here? All right, did you see the title, or you just wanted to talk? Because I'm thinking about just having an open mic, which is what I started the stream with. But if you guys want to watch this, we can.
No, good evening. No, I was just browsing through and saw you had a stream up.
Fro's always got interesting things to talk about. So, anything else on your mind? Do you want to watch this? What do you guys want to do? We can just talk about whatever. But
I don't know. I mean, I watched pretty much that whole debate. So I mean, I guess I could remember a decent amount of it. Although the particular subject matter at the moment's interesting. Another thing I just want to add on what Pro was saying is I'm sure you might be aware of the something I've been into lately, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's study on stupidity correlating with evil, or basically the pattern of, once you make people stupid enough, they don't really recognize what's evil anymore, and then they just continue along with it, thinking that they're doing good, and it's pretty interesting. There's a couple nice ideas breaking it down.
Yeah. Essentially, that is exactly what Saint Aquinas was saying in his own work, because man, whether smart or dumb, whether inept or competent, is always pursuing his own good. And what Aquinas says is that we can only realize what's good through God and by God, and without God, our pursuit of our good simply comes down to our evil. Or rather, our good will result in evil because it's not done within God. And so Bonhoeffer, who's by the way a confessional Lutheran, is echoing Saint Aquinas, and I'm not even sure he would have realized it. Would have just been it would have been a position he would have come to organically. I'm aware who Bonhoeffer is through a biography of his I read. Outside of that biography, I don't know much about him though, like his other published works, for instance.
No, that's a good point about Aquinas. It's probably a much deeper truth going on there, as far as just calling good evil and calling evil good. I mean, it's one of the most basic forms of corruption, I'd say.
Right, and that's the thing. That kind of goes back to what I was telling Jamie. That's how we got on the subject, because the idea that man is totally depraved isn't accurate. We are good. We're basically good, but it's just in our pursuit of good, we inevitably end up committing evil, because our pursuit of good is not a God's good. It's the way that we think of good. It's kind of our understanding of what is good for us. But what's good for us isn't good for us, because God, our eternal creator, knows what is good for us. And because we don't follow him, our good simply culminates with evil. And so, like I was explaining to Jamie here, when Hitler was slaughtering the Jews and other minorities that he deemed to be lesser than German blood, he wasn't doing it because he hated them. He was doing it for the same reason, he was doing it for the same reason farmers set traps for rats. He was doing it in the same way that a gardener might rip out weeds out of a garden, right? He saw it as a way of preserving German blood and nationality, because for him, that was the ultimate good, and therefore that is the goal that needs to be pursued. Of course, God would disagree, because what Jesus Christ had said is that, because what Jesus Christ had said is that the stronger is to be the servant of the weaker. And Paul echoes this in saying that there's no Jew or Greek. All are under the weight of sin, and therefore under Jesus Christ. And even beyond that, the idea that that the poor and weak have a certain dignity is something that Paul is echoing from Christ also in taking care of the poor. So what's going on is essentially a full rejection of Christianity as seen in Nazi Germany, and I would argue kind of a resurrection of the Roman Empire in a way.
That always floors me when you say that, the Roman Empire thing, because I never expect a Catholic to say that. I know what you mean, though.
I can recall, but way before I ever became a Christian, and it's funny because I was watching Ben-Hur once, and I was sitting around. I was probably like maybe 17 or 18, and I was hardcore pagan at the time as far as like Celtic gods and mythologies and doing like little rituals and candles and that kind of crap. And I remember once it was a scene in Ben-Hur where Ben-Hur's sitting there and he's like, oh, one day there's going to be a God that's, it's Charlton Heston. And he's like, just for the slaves, just for the poor people. And I remember that really kind of affecting me at some point, just being like, that's like, it was just kind of a glimpse just kind of a shimmer in my mind. It real like kind of very briefly of that making sense, because every other god seemed to be just a glorification of something that humans desire and that sort of thing.
Right.
Maybe this is the scene. Let's see.
The very concept of mercy, and that's why I consider just kindness, mercy, to strangers really is supernatural.
But Jim, before we continue on this, you mentioned about me talking about the Roman Empire. Can you what do you mean by that exactly? That you were surprised?
I just never expect you to say.
You there, Jamie?
I suspect, right?
I'm sorry, you kind of timed out there, Jimmy. Can you repeat that last part?
When you say someone wanting to
the resurrection of Rome, yeah.
Yeah, you mean like the empirical Rome, obviously, right?
Absolutely, yes. Because let me illustrate that a bit. Like everybody in this room would agree that what Hitler did to his minorities, as far as his genocide, is absolutely heinous, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd imagine we all do. Even Kel,
even Kelby, no.
yeah. So the whole thing about that is, though, in the context of the ancient world, Hitler really didn't do anything that Rome hadn't already done. Like because the Romans never considered the humanity of the Carthaginians when they raped their women, burned their city to the ground, and then burned and salted their crops.
So that they brought it back?
So that it would cause mass famine, right? Rome committed genocide on the Carthaginians once they conquered them. And even after that, like centuries after that, when Julius Caesar took the throne, right, became emperor, what he did, he marched into Gaul, conquered it, and he was credited for having killed 2 million Gauls. Specifically, as he said, he had put 1 million of them to the sword and put another million into slavery, essentially killing 2 million. And so,
Alexander the Great, I mean, he's looked at totally different.
Yeah, but the thing about it is, but a lot of the ancients did exactly what Hitler would have done, or actually Hitler did exactly what they would have done. And we have gone from essentially looking at these actions as glorifying them to something, seeing them as utterly repugnant. Because again, like with population demographics at the time, the death of 2 million people can be easily compared to the death of like 12 million people in 1939. You can easily make that. Yeah. Accounting for demographics, you could do that.
The population percentage.
Yeah, but moreover though, like today when genocide happens in a Christian society, it is one or two things either happens. It is either ignored or condemned. One of the two. For instance, Britain, which I will say is a Christian country, kind of committed its own share of mass slaughters. However,
firebombing Dresden or whatever, for instance.
No, actually, that was American. But actually, I'm talking about like they committed mass famines throughout Tasmania, Australia, even as far as India. So they kind of have blood on their own hands. But here's the thing: you will find that Britain will ignore its genocides, but it will never come out and praise them. That's the difference between the Christian nations in Rome, because where Christian nations were either ignore or condemn such atrocities, Rome would do this and absolutely applaud themselves for it. Like Julius Caesar committing genocide on the Gauls, essentially what's ethnic cleansing. He was praised for these actions. This was something that made him popular among the Romans. He was never nobody ever was aghast and called him a monster. That's the ethical distance between Rome and the West, because how should I say, when the Third Reich came to power, it was more than just a fascist state. Okay, they understood power and man's dignity in the same way that Rome did, and that is might makes right. If you are mighty, if you have the power, you decide how you are going to wield it. Rome had the power over the Carthaginians and decided to slay as many as they could. Rome had power over the Gauls and decided to slay as many as they could. And when Hitler came to power, he had power over the Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and the Poles, and tried to slaughter as many as he could. So what's going on is that Nazi Germany isn't just a fascist state. It is essentially the resurrection of a governance and of a culture, of a morality that has more to do with Roman Hellenism than it has to do with Christianity.
How could they possibly think they were going to win? But they nearly did, I guess. It's fascinating.
No, they nearly did. The only thing stopping them was Hitler's own ego, because he decided to fight a three-front war would be a good thing. By the way, he was winning on two of them. He was just smashing England to death. Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, really couldn't muster a competent answer against Hitler's forces. It was only when America got involved with her manufacturing power that any European army stood a chance. And so the way I see it is that Rome essentially tried to resurrect herself through Nazi Germany, and
Sure.
and Christendom put that down.
I think that's right. Yeah. Let me play this really
What's
quick.
amazing
too.
is how Germany
Yeah.
itself was pretty much right before Nazism was the most
Technologically advanced country in the world, yeah.
culture, and as well as and Jamie, it's often overlooked that even during pagan Roman times, there's a huge section of them were highly conservative, as far as even we would view conservative, but only within their own internal structure, which makes their genocide of like the Gauls and everybody else even worse, because in a way they had a full recognition of human dignity, like you said, but only within the framework of their own worldview. Because if like what's said about I think it was Cato, it says like the only time his wife ever touched him in public was like during like a thunderstorm when she jumped at lightning, and then he yelled at her for getting close to him. Like
That's so weird too. So they really look down on the other cultures, right? For being
Definitely. Like for instance, let me give you another example. Just the ethical divide that exists between us and Rome. Jamie, what's the definition of democracy?
Governance by the people or something, or by popular. I forget the exact.
By popular vote, I'll accept that. Kelvy, what's the definition of democracy as you understand it?
Mob rule, I guess you could say, maybe. I mean, but not mob, more like the majority, right?
Rule by demos, by demon.
What's that?
No, yeah. Well, basically, all people.
People, yeah, because
every single person has a say. Mob rule, pretty much.
And yeah, that's actually the thing, because both of you are correct in the definition of democracy if we were speaking of today. However, democracy is specifically an Athenian experience, and how they understood democracy was something utterly different, where we would look at democracy and see that everybody has a vote. Essentially, everything is decided by popular vote. This is not how Athens saw democracy, because the democracy, the etymological word literally means the people rule. Okay. And so what's going on is that what people exactly are ruling. Well, in their understanding, it was the Athenian people, because theologically, Athens believed that Athens believed that the Athenian people were raised up by Athena herself from the earth, right? And were given Athens, and we're given this level of civilization by how should I say it? By the very order of Athena herself, by her blessings. And therefore, when it says that the demos rule, they specifically are referring to the Athenian people. Those are the ones ruling. And so, not so, and so the people that had a vote were basically men, could only be men, and they had to be of voting age, as in they needed to be old enough to be conscripted into the army. So Athenian democracy had everything to do with the fact you were a man and you could join the military, and by virtue of that you could have a vote. But specifically, the idea that anybody else would have a say in voting was beyond the pale. Their slaves, people like Sparta, Thebes, other city-states, they were considered less than Athenian. They were considered essentially barbarians, although more of a understandable type of barbarian. Essentially, what democracy was to Athens was Athenian state supremacy, that Athens, by virtue of being Athenian, of being Athena's servants, had a right to command the whole of the earth. And it was only the Athenian people that got a say.
Yeah, it's a fascinating history, especially when you follow the books or the empires of Daniel, and I'm interested in that more. I'd like to learn more about it, how the different powers arose and their ways of doing things, and why is interesting.
Yeah.
I never used to have much interest in that, but it is fascinating.
By the way, it is actually like I'm personally flattered that CJ, the synagogue, is actually like agreeing with me on a lot of the things I'm saying.
Yeah, he's into history, so he should join in, and so we get some more good content between the two of you guys. And
Come on,
Calvinists,
come on, it'll be really nice to have a conversation with you, because I think he disagrees with the fact that humans are basically good. I think because he says humans.
Yeah, he's a Calvinist, so he's total depravity, obviously. So
yeah, obviously. So we're definitely going to disagree on that. But I think everything else I said, we'd find more than the agreement on.
yeah, he's gonna. So tell us about your debate coming up, Fro, and then maybe if CJ will join, he can tell us. He's going to be debating Latent Flowers, I believe, on that subject. In fact.
Oh, I got to see that between him and Latent Flowers. But anyway, so on the 19th here, coming up this next weekend, I'm going to be debating Smokey Saint on whether or not the Inquisitions were ethical. And so as I said, I've been keeping a closed lip on a lot of my arguments, because like I'm saving them for the debate and seeing how they work. And so what's going on is that how would I say that to make a long story short, I think Smokey kind of looks at the Inquisitions as unethical because he views Christianity from the lens of Western liberalism. And historically, that's not how Christianity was ever seen or practiced. And that's all I can say on that for now.
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, he's a Californian, so he's obviously a degenerate. So
That's a good one.
I mean, I'm from Seattle, so you know.
Watching that guy, I had seen him before, and he seemed whatever. Got Dr. Ken, whatever. I started watching a couple of his videos, man, and him, and I really don't want to get involved in all this kind of drama, but these guys are absolutely despicable.
Which one are you referring to? Smokey himself and people surrounding himself with, or people that he has a problem with?
I mean, unless they're all actively rebuking each other 24/7, all of them.
I know. Listen, that's why I associate with these people, but I'm not one of them. I basically come into these rooms to shoot the shit, and that's it. Like, I will come into CJ's room, shoot the shit with him. Jamie's room, I'll shoot the shit with him, even though I fundamentally disagree with both of these gentlemen. That's because for what I'm doing with the Pale Galilean, I simply want to teach Catholicism of what it is. That's all I want to do.
People can have issues, but this guy is sitting here saying how well hung he is, and how he's the father of our faith. And it's like, what?
Who?
Is this what Christianity is to some
Who said
people?
that? Who
I
said
can't-
this?
It's unbelievable.
Yeah, like the thing about it is, like, as long as, like, I only have beef with really one person, and as long as people don't have beef with me, I don't got beef with you. I don't hate you. I got no reason to necessarily rebuke you. Like, here's the thing, like CJ down there, I don't really care whether or not CJ becomes Catholic, right? If he does, that would be great, and that would be all thanks to Christ. But ultimately, all I want to do with CJ is teach him what Catholicism is. Whether or not he converts is beyond my prerogative.
Yeah, I like that position, and I just want to have conversations with people. And the more they're in it, like I want to talk to you about the differences, because there's kind of like a known tension between our two different denominations, and so it'd be interesting because you're actually a reasonable person to talk to, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, not a problem. I try to be.
I mean, I try not to say anything about anyone that I wouldn't say directly to them. So with those particular guys, like I said, that there's some very specific things that I've heard them say that I would actively say, you said this, that's way out of line for anybody that's claiming to be a Christian, period, regardless of so it's just if I can be as dispassionate as possible. Unfortunately, that doesn't often happen.
Yeah, not sometimes. I think CJ wanted to say something. What's up, CJ?
I was just gonna say briefly, as far as the like the goals that we have here, I will admit mine is a little bit more ambitious, in that, and obviously, it's yet to happen, right? The very nature of people who come onto these rooms to have conversation is that they're usually confident in what they believe, right? That's why they're having the conversations. But I certainly do intend on, because it's not so much that I intend on converting people as much as it is that I intend on, well, depends on, I guess, who I'm talking to, but as much as it is that I intend on just having an honest pursuit of truth. And I feel like if I'm right, then the end goal of that would be potentially a conversion to my side. And if I'm wrong, then vice versa, right? And it may take time, or it may never happen at all.
Right.
But,
And you first. Go ahead.
Well, it's just to finish and say that, as long as we are in an honest pursuit of truth, in the end, that goal can be kind of a lofty in the cloud thing, or it can be something that actually manifests in reality. But regardless, I still feel like it's being attained. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
I do, and I respect that. And I mean, it's just like sometimes you just get like kind of burned out, and it's like at this point, I just like to have like honest conversation, and yes, make our.
You there, Jamie?
I was about to say, am I the only one who cut out? But I guess not.
Yeah, no. Yeah, Jamie, you really cut out there. I think you have to try to fix your audio. Yeah, but yeah, taking over where he actually left off. That's what I mean. When you read the Bible, you will never find a single verse, at least none that I'm aware of, where it says to go out and convert the nations. That's not what Christ said. Whether he said to go out and preach the gospel, because conversion ultimately, at the end of the day, is up to God. If one is converted to the cause of Christ, it's because God came down and gave him the gift of faith. Without that gift of faith, you're not coming to Christ. And so what Christ wanted is for all men to was for his followers to preach the gospel. And so long as the gospel is taught and preached, that's all he wants. Jesus will take care of the rest.
And I do agree with that. And I'll also say, too, that I think that allows for a lot more liberty in some things. Like for example, I don't know if you recall, Fro, but there was in one of my open rooms, I had referred to me and you as mutually incompatible versions of Christianity. The implication being that we would come to the agreement that the other person, if they are fully aware, cognizant, know what they're affirming, and indeed do affirm it, that we affirm that person is outside the faith, right? And yet here we are having a dialogue, and we've had dialogues before and after. And I think part of the reason, honestly, is because, that's a cannonball kind of claim, but at the same time, that the person is not like trying to insult you or anything, but that they're just being honest with their beliefs. And it's like, all right, cool, I can deal with this then. We can have this conversation.
Yeah, I know that.
Whereas,
That's actually something that really surprised me about Smokey saying, because what actually started this debate, which I'm going to have with Smokey in another week here, is actually because I was expressing to him my honest beliefs in regards to the Inquisition. Specifically, these were very ethical tribunals that had come on the scene in the medieval ages, and he just lost his absolute crap with me. And basically went into the comments section, and this is a direct quote that Catholics suck the cock of Satan. Now, I'm not swearing. That is literally what he said. He had a very visceral emotional reaction with me. And up to that point, and even now to an extent, I considered him a very level-headed person. But that reaction was incredibly just emotional. And then when I even brought up that it was kind of emotional, I think he realized that himself and just bailed out of the live stream then. Because I think at that point he realized that, okay, I'm in the wrong here. I should probably calm myself down. So yeah, when people are level-headed and just honestly expressing their beliefs, typically I find that is much better conducive for conversation. But when people have emotional grandstand reactions like that, it's not quite the same. It doesn't translate to the same conduciveness.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% agree.
Yeah, I'm totally of that way of thinking. I'm just because that's where you just end up saying dumb stuff or not actually hearing the other person, which is problematic because you don't get anywhere. And so if you're just chill, then you can actually get down into the nitty gritty, perhaps, without anybody flipping out.
I think one thing good to keep in mind in a debate where you're exchanging information, if you're not necessarily trying to convert the other person, because I think that's probably not a good goal, because then if you don't achieve it, you're just going to end up frustrated, as opposed to a decent exchange of information. And the point of that being the audience that's watching it. As you're traveling this journey with the other person, you're throwing seeds at each other, and those seeds are going to bounce off the head of your opponent, and they may very well bounce in front of somebody that it's going to germinate in front of that's watching the debate. And that's, I think, often a good benefit. Now, whether that's for actually good or ill, what a person gets out of that, but I think that's a big part of those types of things, the debates and that sort of thing, is a lot of the people that are going to be watching it.
Well, and also Proverbs 27, I think it is, has two quotes that I like to quote at the end of my debates, talking about, the first one is real popular, iron sharpens iron, and the other one is, which is actually a little bit preceding the former in the verse, talks about letting your praises come from another's mouth and not your own, right? And the principle there is kind of just to say that as much as we like to talk about Jesus had 12 and Hitler had millions, and certainly that's true, at the same time, you can't hide genius, nor can you hide stupidity, or anything in between for that matter, and it will manifest itself eventually. And in an honest pursuit of truth, that tends to actually happen a lot more quickly, namely because the sides that are actually actively involved in it tend to notice it consciously, and then they have their arguments start to adjust and stuff like that, and you move forward in the conversation. And another thing too, while we're on that, is we also just have there's a Douglas Wilson quote that I absolutely love. I find it hilarious because he says when he argues with a Catholic, he feels like he can sympathize with a Roman Catholic who's of a more traditional nature, because they have a mutual experience, and that is that they both know that bizarre feeling of actually believing something, right? And obviously it's in jest, but the point is that I kind of believe in God, I guess, like the Bible and the afterlife and stuff. I'd like to believe I go somewhere when I die, right? That's not really believing a thing, but saying, no, I believe Jesus Christ is my Savior, that he died on the cross, rose again on the third day. He is the creator God. Yehovah is his name, and, going on the different claims. Those are actual tangible facts to believe, right? You actually have something that binds you, that dictates your worldview, that tells you what you can and can't do in certain instances. Yeah, 100%, right? And it makes it, the whole conversation becomes different, such that you can have the most diehard Reformed Protestant and diehard traditionalist Catholic or diehard Sharia Muslim or Orthodox Jew or any of these guys, right? And you get them in a room having a conversation. And for the most part, you're going to get really thoughtful, thought-provoking, honest dialogue between people who mutually respect each other, despite the fact that they will probably agree on almost nothing.
Yeah. Like for instance, CJ, between having dialogue with you and even Ryan the Presbyterian, I have actually come to a healthy respect of Reformed theology, which I did not have before. So like I totally affirm, like even just from my perspective, that that's absolutely true.
Well, and I can actually say a likewise for that, because now, granted, I know that for a lot of people, Taylor Marshall is considered to be more on the schismatic end of things, but Taylor Marshall has had some impact on my actual beliefs. For example, just a couple things right off the bat. Him and Michael Jones have combined to create what eventually 3 years in the future manifested into me believing Jesus was actually born on December 25th. And also Taylor Marshall has, along with C.S. Lewis, given me a newfound respect for the idea of heritage and tradition. And actually through them, I ended up indirectly getting into Edmund Burke and a lot of traditionalist philosophy. But so, that's to say that not only did that give me a newfound respect for those who would actually take the Catholic faith seriously, and a newfound understanding of Catholicism, but also kind of has impacted different elements of my thinking in ways that, of course, would not be directly Catholic per se, right? But which certainly I can find the nucleuses there in certain Catholics that I've listened to. In this case, I've said like Taylor Marshall, and G.K. Chesterton is another one. But you get the idea.
Would you say Scripture in itself is the primary anchor between all of those different faiths, being able to actually come together and have any kind of meaningful dialogue, like being faith in Scripture, or just the general principle of Christ? Which, I mean, we would hope it's Christ, but obviously that's where a lot of the contention comes in.
Well, so I'm going to try and make this brief, but it's kind of a complicated answer in a way, because there is a yes and a no, and it goes to different levels depending on who exactly is in the room for this conversation, right? So, like, for example, if we have a Seventh-day Adventist and a Jehovah's Witness and a also Orthodox Jew, and then myself and Fro, and we're all in a room, right? And we start talking about doctrines that have to do with ideas of literalism or fundamentalism, right? We're probably going to agree on almost every single one of those doctrines. It's possible that we don't, right? Obviously, there are, for example, Catholic apologists who accept the theory of evolution. But for the most part, we're going to agree probably on everything. We're all going to say, yeah, Moses wrote the Torah. And yeah, no, Isaiah was written by one Isaiah in about the year 700. He literally prophesied about Cyrus. And there was an actual Exodus, and it was probably would agree on an early date of the Exodus, and you could just go down the list of factoids, right? And that's because of what you would consider to be today, we put the word fundamentalist on it, but understanding of the Scripture, right? It means what it says and says what it means, kind of a thing. Now, if you start to fill that room up with a few more people who still have honest convictions and who still really want to pursue truth, but who don't have that common thread of believing the Bible, for example, a Buddhist or a Shinto, well, that's no longer going to be the case, right? Somebody who's being honest and who's very true to their beliefs and who's on an honest pursuit of truth, who's a Taoist, has no reason to believe that an Exodus took place in the 1400s BC or that Moses wrote the Torah. You know what I mean? And so in that sense, you get an element of truth to what you're saying in the sense of mutual agreeability, right? But then there's also the element of falsehood there, because I can have a conversation with a Taoist or a Buddhist or a Shinto on a whole lot of things and actually get relatively far. In fact, especially if we're talking to people in the Eastern religions, you would be surprised how much the wisdom literature of the Scriptures and the Eastern philosophies kind of jive really well with each other. right? Now, obviously, those philosophies are pagan, and I'm not trying to say that they're actually like these good things, but there are quotes from the Tao Te Ching that sound like they were literally just straight pulled from the book of Ecclesiastes and copy pasted. To be honest, I kind of think that it's possible they might have potentially been influenced by Solomon's work. But I can't prove that. It's just something I think. But the point is just to say, right, there's still a lot of mutual agreeability there. There's still a lot of honest pursuit of truth. There's still a lot of good conversation and edification on both sides. But we probably couldn't agree on matters of scripture in that case, right? And then there's even in between that Taoist and that group of people who affirm the Bible. Because what about somebody like a Mormon or somebody like a Muslim who sort of affirms the Bible ish, kind of, right? And each of them even to varying degrees from each other, or the in between that Taoist, or excuse me, the Taoist himself would probably be an in between us and an atheist, right? Because he's at least religious. He at least believes in a binding force that somehow explains why we do things and rationality and why things are moral and not moral and stuff like that, whereas an atheist probably wouldn't. And I'm trying to shorten this, but that is just to say that there's a good deal of truth in your question, in that I could answer it yes. Not that your question was dishonest, right? But just in that I could answer the question yes.
Well, no,
but then there's also a good deal
I wasn't trying to. I remember some things I have an almost like eidetic memory on, and like the moment in my very early Christian walk where it struck me, the utter just scripture must be scripture. It must be true. Like where just before it wasn't I didn't believe scripture before. It was just that idea just simply didn't exist in my head. And then suddenly it struck me from listening to particular teachings and that sort of thing where, yeah, if we don't believe in scripture, then who are we listening to? What are we listening to? And for another example, early conversations I would have with my Calvinist wife at the time, not to get into all that, but very specifically, I used to very early on, I would say things like, well, I experienced this, I experienced supernatural things that were this and this and blah, blah, blah. And she would basically say, how do you know that? How do you know you were speaking to this spirit? Or how do you know that you were experiencing what you were experiencing? Ultimately, you don't have any way of validating a single thing. And it struck me, I had no argument against her. I was just like, you're right. Like there's nothing I could, and that furthered my walk of basically not relying on my own logic or my own feelings or my own experiences even. And it struck me kind of like, for example, if I was doing some sort of witchcraft, blah, 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 hooey, boo, hooey, and thinking I was causing something to happen, I kind of had this idea of, well, for all I know, there's a demon standing behind me making it happen, wanting me to think that I'm making it happen, just so I think I have some sort of power, which is going to further lead me away from relying on Christ. And then from that, it's like, holy moly, what do we have to believe? There's nothing. And then except for revelation, which is why, and then that further leads on in recent arguments I've had with Catholic people where they'll say, well, you don't really have any validation for the Bible yourself unless you're a Catholic, giving credence to the church who gave you these scriptures, to which my argument's usually, well, the Holy Spirit gave us these scriptures, and that's where it goes in. Well, who do you say the Holy Spirit speaks to, the councils and all that kind of thing? And, that's where it just expands out from there.
And that is actually that's actually why we need to have dialogue, because how put it, the operation of the Holy Spirit we would obviously see as very different between, like, say, a Catholic communion wherever you've come from, Kelvin. And again, that is why dialogue is so important, because these issues are important, because, like, I would say the church has a different understanding of the Holy Spirit than anybody else in this room, and that it talks to the church generally as a body rather than people as individuals. Although it can do the latter, it can speak to you as an individual. Normally, it speaks to the church as a whole rather than individual people. So
I
yeah,
said- I
there's
had no idea, even barely, the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant within the
Okay.
first like several
See-
months of being a Christian.
You know what's
Well-
funny about that comment, Kelby, is I was just about to make the comment that it's amazing to me how somebody like myself, because what you just said, Fro, sounds like you came directly out of a Douglas Wilson sermon. But obviously there's a twist there, right? In the sense that like what is meant specifically can vary. Like, for example, when you refer to church, you're probably referring to specifically those, priests and fathers and archbishops and cardinals and popes
Roman
and
Catholic.
councils and all.
Yes.
Exactly. And whereas I tend to have this view that the church is just sort of the general body of Christian believers, right? And it's interesting because what we end up kind of having there is not only a very similar perspective as to how we get places, but because of that little difference, we end up getting to just this slightly different conclusion. Like, for example, on things like canon, right? Because of the Protestant understanding being that this is what was preserved down through the ages as far as the general church is concerned, the general body, and some people would say the ecclesiastical text, although that kind of, in my opinion, is a misnomer because it implies that it's being passed down by ecclesiologies, which is the exact opposite of what people are actually saying. But it's the preservation of tradition through the various chains of evidence, right? And what we can affirm through those various chains of evidence is consistently 39 books, and sometimes others, and sometimes not others, and sometimes even various lists of others. But 39 books is in all of them. Sometimes they're numbered differently, like, for example, 1st and 2nd Samuel are just Samuel, right? Or the 12 minor prophets are just one big book. But it's the same general text, and you can find it in Jewish text, and you can find it in Orthodox text, and you can find it in Catholic text, and all this other kind of stuff, right?
That's
But
the Old
because you have a
right? Old Testament only.
Right, exactly. But because the Catholic has a specific tradition and a specific hierarchy, that specific tradition gets to be followed in its unique details, right? Which is interestingly enough, that's what ends up creating the difference between our two different understandings of tradition, right? The broad sense of tradition versus this tradition saying that this particular line of tradition is actually accurate. And yet, really, the point I'm trying to get at is, fascinatingly, the initial comment is the same, which is God generally speaks to the body rather than the individuals within the body and moves them as a cohesive unit.
There's small t tradition and large and capital T, right? Maybe. I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. You saw that from my lecture today, didn't you, Jamie?
Yes, I did.
All right. All right.
I do want to play this to get your guys' reaction.
Yeah. Play it.
And I think it's on point. It could be contribute to the conversation here. It's not too long.
So can we start off by having you explain maybe the difference between how the average person thinks about how persuasion takes place and, the dark truth about how it really takes place?
Okay, so when I die and I think about what I've left behind, eventually it'll probably just be one metaphor. And that metaphor is that the mind is divided like a rider on an elephant. And the rider represents your conscious verbal reasoning, the stuff you're aware of, the stuff that uses logic. And everything else is the elephant. It's the automatic processes. It's the 99% of what's going on in your mind that you're not aware of. And I developed this metaphor in my book, The Happiness Hypothesis, and then it was made famous not by me, but by Chip and Dan Heath in their wonderful book, Switch. And what the advice boils down to is most of us spend a lot of our time trying to persuade other people's riders. We give them all these reasons. Here are the 7 reasons why you're wrong or why you should see it my way. When in fact, the way to persuade people is to speak to the elephant first. The elephant is a lot stronger than the rider. If you get somebody feeling the truth of what you're saying or feeling that they like you or like what you're saying, and the elephant kind of wants to go in your direction, then it's effortless to persuade the rider to go along. But if the elephant is digging in its heels, the elephant doesn't want to go, doesn't want to be dragged along by you to the conclusion that you're trying to get him to, then there's really nothing you can say that will persuade the rider. political discourse can work once you recognize that we're all mostly elephants. I don't mean Republicans. I mean, we're all mostly emotional social creatures. It can work, but it can't work if you're psychologically unsophisticated. And this is the problem that plagued the Democrats for so long. They just kept thinking about messaging as though if they could just get the right configuration of words and put it up into message space, it will somehow persuade people. And it doesn't work that way.
One thing I drew from reading your work is that you yourself, in the course of doing this work and coming to these conclusions, maybe began to have a little bit more understanding for people who disagree with you than you might have had before. And you seem to be suggesting that instead of just writing off half the population as being irrational idiots, we ought to think about them maybe a bit more sympathetically.
Absolutely. That's what happened to me. I was always on the left. When I was growing up, I was raised Jewish in New York. I went to Yale. I don't know if I ever met a conservative. I guess there were 3 or 4 conservative students at Yale when I was there. But I never spoke to them because they were so yucky and we all hated them. I mean, it was a really partisan time in the 80s, and it's just gotten worse since then. So I actually started studying political psychology. I had been just looking at how morality varies across nations, and I started studying how it varies across the left-right divide, in part because I was so frustrated with the Democrats, since Al Gore's failed campaign. I was so frustrated that they didn't know how to talk about morality. But as I dug into it and as I really made a commitment to understanding conservatives, and I didn't even think about libertarians at the time, I just saw left-right, I began to see that if you listen to people who differ from you, they actually know things that you don't know. Whereas when you only talk to people that agree with you, you don't learn very much from them. So in the course of doing this work, I actually kind of dropped. I'm no longer a liberal. I'm just kind of nothing now. I'm a professor. I study this stuff. I find it incredibly interesting. Everyone's got insight into problems. So yeah, it helped me step out of the matrix, as it were.
In your work, you go ahead and list a series of categories, and you say these are the different ingredients in how we come to be who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about some of those?
Sure. So my research since graduate school has always been on morality, moral psychology, what it is, where it comes from. And in reading ethnographies, in reading a lot of anthropology, and doing some field work in India and in Brazil, I came to see that morality varies a lot around the world. And it's as though there are these sort of issues that seem to just tweak our minds. They just, if you see a child being harmed, it's awful. It's like having a drop of lemon juice on your tongue. It just activates a taste bud that says, no, this is wrong. Or if somebody is shirking or not pulling their fair share of the weight, or if somebody is disloyal, or if somebody is disobedient, or if somebody behaves in a way that's degrading or disgusting. Now, I just named 5 foundations: care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And some of your listeners might have thought that the last couple aren't really morality with this, disobedience, sanctity. One thing we know about libertarians, my colleagues and I have done what I think is the largest study of libertarian psychology, is that libertarians focus primarily on liberty. So that's the 6th foundation is liberty. Libertarians have the strongest sense of personal liberty, and they want to extend it to others. And they have the weakest sense of group loyalty, respect for authority, or a sense of personal sanctity or purity. So libertarians are quite unique in their morality. I mean, they're diverse, of course, as well. But libertarians, in some ways, are more different from liberals and conservatives than liberals and conservatives are from each other. So my approach has been to identify the taste buds of the moral sense, and then the 3 major families of moral cuisines.
To be fair,
progressive, social conservative, and
I gotta have
libertarian.
a little bit of because there's a lot of good stuff in this for sure, but I just kind of want to point out some things as far as the libertarian, libertarians being closer to, or conservatives and liberals being closer to each other than libertarians to, the other of the two. I think that there are ways in which that could be true, certainly, but they're not really the kind of ways that he's saying. Like, for example, he talks about things like loyalty to the group. But loyalty to the group is kind of a really weird way of putting it, because the conservative and the liberal would see those two things very differently. For example, conservative loyalty groups tend to have some sort of a foundation in heritage. things like your language or your religion or the kingdom that you hail from, or your nation or something like that. Whereas the liberal definition of group is something a lot more vague and what's the word, amorphous, right? Things like your socioeconomic status or classes as far as oppressed and unoppressed, or proletariat versus the workers, if you want to go really far back. No, excuse me, proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. Yeah, proletariat is the workers. And you know what I mean? So there's certain elements of truth to that. But I don't know if I don't know if that's a helpful way of articulating. Right.
He's just about, I mean, I think he was being really general. He's about to lay out the differences between, it's kind of interesting. I do want to hear what you think of because I think he's about to do the.
Are you familiar with Thomas Sowell, where there's the idea of the idea of cosmic justice, where people have this idea of when they witness something that they perceive as an injustice, then they feel it to be their their cosmic obligation to point it out and to fight against it, which then goes into where a person is anchored, that is, into their moral center, whether they have nothing or whether it's and how convinced they are that they're right, or how wishy-washy they are and how bendable they are to persuasion, and how hardened people get to certain things.
Sure. Yeah. I love Thomas Sowell too. And I'll cut it off as soon as he gives the categories that describe the groups and we can talk about it. I just want him, I think he's about to do that, and then I'll shut it off.
Okay, nice. But but when we do that, I want to kind of respond to what CJ was saying about libertarianism, because having been a former libertarian myself, I want to correct CJ on just a couple things he said, but let's continue.
Here's the simplest way to summarize what's unique about libertarians. There are these two personality dimensions.
Jamie, mute yourself.
Empathizing and systemizing.
Thank you. Sorry.
And both of them are strengths. People who can think systemically. In academics, I know you have a PhD in academics and engineering, and being able to think systematically is an incredible strength. Libertarians are the best of any group at thinking systemically and systematically. That's why they're attracted to economics. Then there's this other trait, empathizing. It's the degree to which you feel others' pain. I don't mean that you care about what happens to them. I mean that if somebody pokes themselves in the eye accidentally, you flinch because boy do you feel it. Or if they tell a sad story, you cry. Libertarians are much lower. No, I shouldn't say much. Libertarians are statistically significantly lower than liberals or conservatives on those traits. So it's not a coincidence that libertarians are overwhelmingly male, because these are exactly the traits on which men and women differ. What we found in our paper, so I'd urge your listeners, if you just Google understanding libertarian morality, and then you put in my name, HAIDT, you'll find our paper. It's free online. It has all the graphs, all the tables. And what we find is that libertarians, whether they're male or female, have the most masculine cognitive style. And so even female libertarians are more masculine. And I don't mean macho. I mean higher systemizing, lower empathizing, more rational. And so when I present these results, what I generally find is that libertarians generally say, yep, that's us. Yep, that's right.
A point that Charles Murray has made is that when the government takes over certain functions, then certain aspects of society, of natural society, just tend to atrophy. If the state is going to take care of this or that function, then ordinary people are not going to volunteer to do that thing. And then the result is that the natural sympathy that people might have for each other is interfered with, because this voluntary aspect disappears. So anyway, I mean, I realize that's not the central thesis.
No, but that is a perfect example of how that is a really subtle point which you can't really grasp unless you're good at thinking systemically. And so it's a kind of a meta point. It's an understanding of how systems can crush personal caring and responsibility and relationships. But the average person, the more typical person, just says, oh, but if people are suffering, the government has to care for them. We can't just abandon them. So what I'm saying is libertarians are the clearest thinkers. They are the best thinkers about complex social questions and problems.
All right. In that case, I'll let you go.
Okay. Well, there you go. And back to your earlier question about how do you persuade people, acknowledge.
Shoot, this is the wrong clip. I wanted him because there's all these categories that he mentioned there, and he talks about it's that liberals have like just 2 or 3 of them, but conservatives tend to have like 5, which include ones they don't even think of, what do you say, sanctity, liberty, and disgust are very different too between the two, and it's really interesting. But go ahead, Fro. I know you wanted to respond to the libertarian thing. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the thing about libertarian philosophy is that he is right. I would say that libertarians, and again, having been one myself, I can say this from experience. We are very different from conservatives and liberals. And so much that CJ is right. When it comes to conservative circles, you have a much more robust view of what a group is. Whereas when you go to the like liberal sectarian, right, you have this idea that liberals are just like the marginalized of society, oftentimes divided into racial groups, whereas conservatives see more kind of like the nation state. The difference is that both of these groups, liberals and conservative, recognize there is a group to belong to. Libertarians don't do that, and I never did that. I never identified any group I really belonged to at all because I was kind of my own island. That's basically what the philosophy is about. It is about the it is about how would I say? It is like on its base, it's the idea that man should have these liberties as he should practice them the way he sees fit. At the same time, however, what is going on is that libertarians view kind of themselves as the first, right? That you first take care of yourself, you take care of someone else later on. And so what that does is that kind of removes moral responsibility from you and removes moral responsibility, moral obligations that you otherwise have to your nation and to the people around you. And again, I can say this having been libertarian. In fact, like it's even been proven out in experimentation. I don't think y'all have heard about this, but this happened, I think, just 10 years ago. There was a town that was essentially bought out by a group of conservatives. They literally bought an entire town for themselves, kind of a community where it would be a community by conservatives and for conservatives. And it turned into a hellhole very quickly because with libertarian philosophy, it starts and begins with you. And as much as it is good to help other people out, there is no moral obligation to do so. And so what ended up happening is that there was basically no police force because someone has to pay money to pay the police. And of course, nobody wanted to do that. So crime was incredibly rampant in this libertarian commune. Moreover, they didn't. Everybody decided to burn their trash instead of actually like getting like sanitation services to deal with it. So there was the dump trucks that would operate in the rest of the community just passed their commune right by. But moreover, people eventually just got lazy and stopped burning their trash completely. In fact, many of them would actively feed the wildlife around their commune, often kind of bears and timber wolves, which meant like bear sightings in and around that commune were like 7 times the national average, to the point where there was a guy that got mauled by one. And like it just devolved into a hellhole very quickly. And then there were 2 murders. The first one that was committed in that town, in that commune, for like 75 years up to that point. And it began because conservative philosophy and ideologies were actively practiced. And so, again, I sympathized with libertarians because on paper, the philosophy sounds really good. But in practice, it basically is simply mooring you, dislodging you from moral obligations that even God says are binding upon you. And so what I would disagree with Synagogue on is that libertarians, they do not have a group. Because we ourselves are the beginning and the end of our philosophy. And so where liberals, they have a group which they belong to. Conservatives have a group which they belong to. Libertarians don't have that. So I think that this psychologist is absolutely right. Libertarians are very different and are more dissimilar than conservatives and liberals are dissimilar from each other, because they both understand there are in fact moral prerogatives one must meet, whereas like libertarians don't have that.
See, so there's a lot that I would agree with, but there's also a lot I would kind of disagree with, right? So first, let me just say that I think is if we have a very strict definition of libertarianism to mean those who are purely libertarian, meaning strict adherence to the NAR principle, or strict adherence to something like Ayn Rand's. I don't know how you say her last name, but objectivism.
Ayn Rand, yeah.
Ayn Rand, yeah. Then I think that you're probably largely correct, right? But if libertarianism is even slightly broader than that, I think that we do end up seeing a little bit of difference. For example, those who are considered to be right libertarian, like your Ron Pauls and your Ammon Bundys and the Tea Party and that kind of stuff, right? Have this, and of course, they're just going back to things that we saw in the early constitutionalism of the 1700s, 1800s. This idea of a rugged individualism, but it's like almost like a system of units, right? Rugged individuals make rugged families, which make rugged neighborhoods, which make rugged states, which make rugged countries, right? And so you have this sort of idea of the group and the hierarchy, but it's also something that is sort of based in this idea of bottom up, make everything strong, rugged, tough, that kind of thing, and functioning like a well-oiled machine, right? And that even goes back, I think, for a lot of people, and myself included, I would attribute that to a lot of the stuff that happened around the Reformation, with people talking about and it's. I think recommend people watch what Ryan Reeves has put out about this, because there's a lot of miscommunication about what actually is meant by the quote sacred and the secular and the separation of that and stuff like that amongst Reformed theologians. But suffice it to say, around the time of the Reformation, there started to become a very persistent idea Europe-wide that work ethic and working incredibly hard and having strong units all the way down and stuff like that was a really important thing that just grew and grew and grew until it eventually came to its, I would say, head in the founding of the United States of America, in a political sense. And in that sense, like I said, you're going to have that very rugged, individualistic, you have to take care of you and your own first kind of thing, coming from those who we would consider to be probably most traditionalist, Burkean constitutionalist in the modern world. Again, the aforementioned like Ron Paul and Ammon Bundy and people of that nature, right? Other thing too to kind of point out in that sense is, even if you get to a little bit stricter of libertarians, like for example, Spike Cohen, who was the vice presidential candidate in 2020. Spike Cohen has a very robust understanding of the group, but his group is human wide, right? It's a general all people thing. It's almost like a right wing hippie kind of thing, if we're being honest. And it ends up creating a idea that it's not so much that you're I don't know how to put it, right? Because it's not so much that you're bound by the group per se, as much as it is that it's you scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of thing. Everything needs to be cohesive and working, and we all are humans living on the collective planet. Very much like a commune in that sense. Actually, it's interesting you use the word commune. I'll have to look into what exactly would had happened there, because it does make sense that kind of thing would end up falling apart in that way, right? But then the other thing I would point out here too is when it comes to the differences between liberals versus libertarians versus conservatives, and even the various kinds of conservatives and all that, right? I can use myself as a perfect example here, and this is why I say I just don't know if it's necessarily helpful per se to think of this in terms of like, well, we're actually closer to each other than these guys or vice versa, because the categories are so fractured and various, right? So for me personally, I am pretty firmly an ethno-nationalist. And what I mean by that is I believe that every ethnos, meaning individual group of people, has the sovereign right and duty to preserve the right of a state for the maintenance of their culture within their homeland. I would even go as far as to say an ethnos is not free if it does not have a homeland. So just as a quick example, Irish people can live in the United States, right? And they can have children who have children who have children who have children who have children and so on in the United States. But if ever anything happens where all of a sudden somebody decides it's not okay for Irish people to live in the United States, or Irish culture is just becoming extinguished entirely in the United States, there's an Ireland to go back to, right? And because of that, the Irish people can be said to have a true freedom, in my opinion, right? In the sense that ultimately there is always a safe haven for people of the Irish ethnicity, and for people who wish to preserve Irish culture in the Irish homeland. And so at least there it is preserved always, if not also in the United States and England and etc. The libertarian and the liberal both would have no concept of that whatsoever. The concept of heritage being definitional to you, or the state, the nation, the ethnos, needing a state to actually have true self-determination and true freedom. I mean, those concepts don't even exist amongst liberals and libertarians, right? And I would go as far as to say, in the same way that groups don't really exist amongst the libertarians, hierarchies really only exist amongst the traditionalists, as far as true hierarchies, right? The traditionalists go as far as to say there are things are matters of the haves and the have-nots as a matter of fact, not as a matter of social construct or anything like that.
Hierarchies, those are necessary.
Yeah, exactly. And in a lot of instances, when you talk to the libertarian or the liberal, right? Hierarchies are figments of our imaginations. They're subject to change on a whim. In the case of a liberal, they would go as far as to say they outright do not exist. They would say, affirm what I would personally call exhaustive equality of persons, which I think is absurd on its face. But the idea that we are equal in every way conceivable.
Scary. Yeah, that would look really ugly. Nobody actually wants that.
Yeah, exactly. And nobody wants that. Exactly right. It's a terrifying reality to even think of, but it's the way the liberals tend to think. And libertarianism is much closer to that than it is to my view, right?
True.
Which is that, for example, if we lived under a monarchy, and if I don't even have to even go there, President Biden, I will refer to him as President Biden and Mr. President and all the other kind of things that he deserves, because he's the president. It doesn't matter that I cannot stand him, and I find him to be an incredibly corrupt person, and I don't think that he's even cognizant, because as a traditionalist, that I believe that he is, he has the position on the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is a matter of fact. It's not a matter of just the system. You know what I mean? To the libertarian or the liberal, what I just said is gibberish. I might as well be writing Japanese. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, CJ, because
what happened?
Yeah, we'll let you go, Jay, on this, Jamie. But real quick, I almost agree with everything you said there. Although I think I think we disagree on what exactly an ethos is. But in any case, what you're describing is why I subscribe to integralism. So you're absolutely right on that. I think we find there's very little disagreement between us in that regard. Real quick, just yes or no. Do you know what integralism is, CJ?
I don't think that I do.
Okay, so I think I'll talk about that once Jamie makes his point here with the screen with the graph in front of us.
Sorry, I had to do that. That's what happens if everybody gets equal opportunity, or equal outcomes here forced on them. You just don't have any diversity, actual diversity. I mean, how far could you take that sort of thing? I mean, it's insane. You only want that. It's kind of like a NIMBY thing. It's like not in my backyard. It's like until it gets close to me, that's fine. But
exactly,
throw money at it.
Well, real quickly, there are some, like the Amish, for example. People just think that the Amish just don't use cell phones, and that's what it means to be Amish. They do a lot of things that we would consider quite bizarre, including an extreme egalitarianism. The same thing I would say, this whole idea of exhaustive equality of persons, such that you're not allowed to actually play instruments, because if you play instruments, it could demonstrate that one of you is more skilled than the other. And I'm not kidding. You can actually look that up. There's no choir or band or anything like that in a Amish worship service, because it would demonstrate level of talent, and the level of talent means that people are unequal, and if people are unequal, then you don't have this exhaustive equality of the persons. And
horrible misunderstanding, I think.
Yeah,
well,
exactly, right.
They are Anabaptists. That's where it comes from, and more along like here's the issue. And this is the full ignorance of our society. Fact of the matter is, when people look at Amish, they see a bunch of white guys. It's like, no, they're not white. They're Amish. That's what they are. Like, these people are a very distinct ethnicity. They are not Caucasian in the same way that the average American is. And so because of that, they kind of have their own unique culture, their own society. And as Jamie said, a very extreme understanding of equality that I think a lot of us would be uncomfortable with. Now it might be a libertarian's paradise, taking their beliefs to the logical conclusions, but still, it is a culture that one needs to be Amish to really understand.
The interesting question there for me is like, so there's like a point of like, there's a point of being soft, right? Or what people will commonly, like, you know, if they're being a meme lord or whatever you want to call it, you know, like they're being soy or whatever. It's like, there is a point where you're like trying to protect yourself so much that you're really not growing, let's say in piety or in like obedience to God. Like, I don't think God wants people who white knuckle his commandments, let's say, but, you know, and people like don't want to have competition on a healthy level, or, you know, the thing with the instruments, it's like, no, we should be so loving that we can appreciate each other for the gifts God gave us without being jealous or contentious.
True, but again, like the issue is that these people are Anabaptists. That is their religious affiliation. And so if you want to understand the Amish, you need to understand the Anabaptists first. And what they're doing, like, how do I say this? When the Anabaptists arrived on the scene in Reformation times, they were burned at the stake both by Catholics and Protestants alike. And the reason being, because even for their own times, even for the Protestants, Anabaptists were incredibly revolutionary. And to this day, they still are. They will believe and hold certain doctrines, such as what CJ described, that no mainline Christian denomination would hold on to today, because it has that kind of revolutionary quality to it that many just aren't comfortable with.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting too. I don't, you know, I have a lot of disagreement with how the Anabaptist thing was handled, but it is, to back up what Fro was saying, it is 100% true that, you know, that you can even start to name the names like Knox and Calvin and Luther. They did not like these guys at all. And Luther actually was quite detestable in the sense that he actually said, because the whole point of the original point of dispute between Anabaptists and everybody else, interestingly enough, ended up being accepted all around Protestantism, which is the idea of believer's baptism, right? Where you baptize only fully conscious believers rather than babies or entire households or things like that, right? And so Martin Luther made the quip that we should tie millstones around them and then baptize them for good, which of course you guys can, you know what the you know what the point is there, right? Obviously,
They like swimming. They like to swim.
Yeah, exactly, right.
What a grand crap wizard. That's what I like to call Luther, as much as I appreciate him.
It is interesting because I consider Luther to be a hero, and yet at the same time, the fact that I consider Luther to be a hero is part of the reason why I have a much more nuanced view on historical figures than I think a lot of people are comfortable with, because I have had to, you know, I've had to wrestle with this idea that the Martin Luther was in many ways a truly detestable man.
Oh yeah.
And the thing is, though, is in a way that's freed me in some ways, because you start to look at a lot of people, and a lot of people were kind of detestable. For example, Abraham Lincoln owned a concentration camp. Like 30,000 people died there. You know what I mean? And that's just
What?
that's just never talked about. Or how
Hey, how dare you? Abraham Lincoln was a saint. He freed the slaves, don't you know?
Well, to be fair though, there's some truth to that, right? In that, like Abraham Lincoln is the president who did more than any other person before or after to actually pass on what we would probably agree is a true definition of equality, which is equality between persons as far as our value, right? All made in the image of God, and that extends to a black person just as well as to a white person or to a Japanese person, or even in a lot of instances you don't even have to specify with like ethnos or race there. You can also talk about like a 7-year-old is just as much a person as a 70-year-old, right? Or male versus female, or etc. And yet at the same time, Lincoln is single-handedly responsible for, like I said, this detestable camp that can only really be described as a concentration camp. He is responsible for the largest mass execution in American history. Ask Native Americans about Abraham Lincoln, you get a whole litany of crimes against their sovereignty. And I'm not saying that in a way to mock them. I'm saying like the legitimate grievances, right? He suspended habeas corpus, which is your right, your 4th through 6th amendments, right? Just suspended them outright, and he had people arrested in Maryland and Delaware and other places around the border for being too pro-Confederate. So, like, imagine you have a situation in the United States where Joe Biden thinks that Alex Jones and Brandon Tatum are a little bit too pro-January 6th guys, and so they end up being in prison. And they never get a trial. They just sit there in prison for the next 4 or 5 years until he decides to let them out. And sometimes they don't come out because the aforementioned, death camps, or suspended posse comitatus, which is the idea that the law enforcement officers and the military officers need to be separated. You cannot have your law enforced by the military. Lincoln said to hell with that, or at least as far as the border states were concerned, and he invaded his own country, according to him, even, right? That's not according to the South, that's according to him. And in fact, that was even the catalyst for 4 of the states seceding. And you have this is a huge laundry list of things that make Lincoln like a truly kind of detestable person. Like, it's gross that this person gets a statue, and yet at the same time, there's a reason for that statue. Like, it's not there for no reason. The guy is more responsible than any other person for the freedom of African Americans today, the ending of the institution of slavery, the preservation of the Union, which would go on to become a far more powerful and prosperous nation than it had ever been, right? And you don't get to just pick one of those sides like the modern day Dixiecrat or the Lincoln lover, right? Because they're both wrong unless you actually have them both together, in which case they become the actual story of Abraham Lincoln. And that's true with Martin Luther King, and that's true with Malcolm X, and that's true. And the reason it starts to become uncomfortable is because now you start to look at people like, for example, Julius Caesar, right? And Julius Caesar, and actually Fro was talking about this earlier, Julius Caesar is really no different than Adolf Hitler and vice versa. They both committed acts of heinous genocide that could only be described as systematic, meaning they were actively seeking out people of this group to kill them and nothing more, right? What we would consider to be, like I said, death camps in modern day, Germany, or 1940s Germany. It's not really modern day, but comparatively, it's not like they were the exact same thing because of lack of technology, but there's very similar things that Julius Caesar did as far as like with the Gauls and even to some of his own people. And yet Julius Caesar is the guy in a Shakespeare play, and Hitler is Darth Sidious. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying that.
Yeah, I know, right?
But it's true. It's just a matter of fact, right? And my whole point is that the catalyst for being able to see historical figures like this was actually Martin Luther, because there's 2 sides to Martin Luther that every Protestant should be very well aware of. The one side is the side that basically gave us religious freedom, and the other side is what Luther actually thought about that religious freedom.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, Beckel's here. Hi, Beckel. Anyway, on that note, I wanted to actually talk about. I wanted to say something else about that because it brings something else up that's interesting. Because
Link is
mentioned.
pinned.
What's up?
Sorry about that. I just wanted to let him know. Link is pinned. Feel free to
I
join.
got you. Okay. Yeah. So, what's going on here is like again, just to highlight the ethical difference between like our civilizations are like in how to say CJ, have you ever read Percy Jackson the Lightning Thief as a kid?
I did.
Yeah, okay, also awesome. So the character of Medusa, how is she presented? Do you remember?
Yeah, kind of like a monstrous serpentine kind of creature. Is not very similar to the myth itself. The myth was trying to, obviously portray her kind of as a beautiful woman. I think people don't tend to realize that, but she was like a monster, basically, like this. What would you say? Almost like a Bigfoot in the sense that it's like, mythical, so it's sort of semi-sapient and all that kind of stuff, but more creature than person.
Didn't she have a snake body and a snake hair?
So how's the character of Medusa kind of portrayed in the book? Because like how's like as far as the movie, from what I've seen, it's actually kind of revealed in her interactions with Percy Jackson that Medusa had actually kind of had a romantic fling with his father Poseidon, and it kind of fell south. Do you remember that in the book?
Well, so this is one of those areas where, because of how long ago it is, I don't remember what's from the book and what's from mythology. Because I remember the story of Medusa and what happened with Poseidon, and then of course I've also read not only the Lightning Thief but also the Sea of Monsters.
Right.
So the first two in the series, but not the whole thing. But go ahead.
And so now what I wanted to say is that in the movie, and I assume this is taken from the book too. I haven't seen I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary. But in the movie, what's going on is that Zeus's lightning has been stolen, right? And so Percy Jackson basically goes on this great road trip across the United States as a way of getting Zeus's lightning back. And on the course of his journey, he comes across Medusa, who becomes a kind of a minor antagonist of the story. And as it's revealed, Percy Jackson's father, who is Poseidon, had a romantic fling with Medusa, and it fell south. And she kind of holds a bitter grudge against Percy and his father for that. What's interesting, though, is that's not how the original myth ever played out. In the original myth, Poseidon and Medusa never had a romance of any kind. What was going on is that Medusa was actually a priestess for Athena in her temple, and she was a very, very striking, beautiful young lady. But in order to be a priestess, she had to be celibate during her years of service to Athena. And what had happened is one day Poseidon sees her and sees her beauty, and then he comes down into the temple of Athena and rapes her on Athena's altar. And so, because Medusa lost her virginity on Athena's altar, Athena punishes Medusa by turning her into a gorgon. She has no problems and no qualms with Poseidon because, as a god, this kind of behavior is expected of him. And so what's essentially going on in the Greek mythology is that Medusa, literally a rape victim, is punished for being raped and then subsequently killed by Perseus, who of course Perseus is kind of like a stand-in for that character in Greek mythology. But understand, the only way this story, this mythology, could ever be made palatable to a Christian audience is by completely Christianizing the myth. Because do you really just imagine the idea that a rape victim is going to be the bad guy in a children's book? But of course, in the myth, that's exactly what's going on. So the only way that the relationship between Medusa and Poseidon could be any way palatable is by utterly changing the myth to work far better and more consistent with Christian sensibilities. And moreover, even before that, when with the movie Hercules, when Disney put out that film, over 90% of the film is at odds with the actual myth of Hercules, because Hercules himself was a real bastard when it comes to Christian morality. Like he was just an awful human being, like just essentially human scum. And what's going on is that the reason that the movie that Disney put out, the reason it parts with like 90% of the myth, is because 90% of what Hercules does is utterly incompatible with the Christian worldview. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, and there's a lot of truth on that, actually. And I think there's a couple things that I could kind of add as far as potential examples of that as well. So, one example is it's been noted by a lot of the woke crowd that very obviously Achilles, according to the literature, has a homosexual relationship with Patroclus, right?
No, he doesn't.
And the whole point that, of course, the woke crowd is trying to make is that homosexual relationships have been a thing for a very long time, going all the way back to ancient Greece. This would be provided that this was a historical event. And I actually tend to think
CJ, wait, hold on. Please tell me you're going where I think you're going.
Oh, I might be. Hopefully,
Okay.
Hopefully I am. I hope we're on the same page here. Because I tend to think it is a historical event, and I also tend to think Achilles was a real person. Although there's a lot of mythology in this, obviously, right? And assuming that we can just take this particular detail as true, it is true. I mean, it's not even ambiguous that Achilles has a homosexual relationship with Patroclus. There are two very interesting things about this relationship. The first is that Patroclus is something like 16 years old, and Achilles would be something like in his mid-30s, right? So we're talking about a relationship between a just barely post-pubescent boy, teenage boy, and a grown man, right? But the other thing is they're cousins. Like they're related to each other, right? And those details to the Greek audience, when it comes to their heroes being incestuous and not quite pedophilic, that's not the technically accurate word, but there is a technically accurate word, and the point is it's not cool, right? Yeah, pederast, thank you. And pederastic, right? That didn't even bother them because it was just normal. It was just a thing that happened. In fact, there's Cicero talks about boys that he had personally. Cicero's considered to be an upright and honorable man in Roman history, and that's a historical figure, right? But the point is, Achilles is a hero who's thrown up there. And now, when you get these stories, like for example, the movie Troy, or any other modern retelling of the Trojan War, it's just like he had this older brother kind of relationship with this person, and he cared for him a lot, and maybe he was like an orphan or something, and so that's why he takes him under his wing, or whatever it happens to be. The point is, though, there's no insinuation that this 35, 40-year-old man is in the back of the tent screwing this 16-year-old boy who he happens to be cousins once removed with, because to our modern audience, or to any audience within the last 1,500 years, really, that's just absolutely horrid.
Yeah, but moreover, you more or less touched on what I was going to say, but moreover, what Achilles is doing here, this isn't necessarily homosexuality, as much as it, well, let me make it clear. It clearly is, but it's not homosexuality as we would understand it today, because in order to put these relationships, to make sense of these relationships, we need to put them in their ancient context. And in today's Christian civilization, sex is usually looked under the lens of equality, that both partners that engage in a sexual relationship are fulfilling something, are doing something that is life fulfilling, something that is in a sense sacred, something that they kind of have an equality in doing that. Man is equal to his wife, and yet this sexual union, the conjugal act, brings about children. And so what's going on is that sex is framed and kind of and is used under the lens with the understanding of a loving relationship involving the conjugal act. So essentially, when a man makes love to his wife, it is understood that both the wife and husband love each other with the love of Christ together. And sodomites today have essentially used this understanding in their own relationships, as misguided as that is. But what's going on is that in the ancient context, this is not at all what is going on, because sexuality in the ancient world was not framed by any understanding of love, but was framed by the understanding of power. That a man didn't make love to his wife, didn't have sex with his wife because he loved her, but because she was his to have sex with. By very virtue that she takes seed and can't give any, means that she is, by her very virtue, much weaker than him. Therefore, he has the right to both physically and sexually dominate her. And what that means in practice is that not tonight, honey, is not an option. And so what's going on is that when Achilles is making love to his cousin, he isn't making love to him with the understanding that he has the same love and affection that a man may have for his wife, although he may think so. But that sexual act is framed in terms of power. That Achilles isn't raping this boy because he loves him. Achilles is raping this boy because Achilles has power over his cousin. In fact, to be in that position, to actually take seed, to take a seminal fluid from a man, was considered a very dishonorable place in a relationship, because what it said is that it clearly made you as the lesser. You were basically taking on the role of a female when you were a male. Therefore, you were seen as less valuable, even less, almost less human to an extent. So, yes, I would agree. These are homosexual acts on display, but this isn't homosexuality, at least not the way we understand it in the Christian West. It's something entirely different, framed from an entirely different cultural understanding.
Look at this. Here's a really brief, horrible thing that goes on in Afghanistan here, and it's a similar thing you're talking about. Let me just briefly play it. It's 1 minute long.
بازمزار سرما بازی هم نکردم. من را بردن دست قریه بزرتی نام دارد. همراه من فعل لغات هم انجام دادم. دوباره یک نفرش
من کارچی داشتم در پنسیلوانیا ملی باز پس جواب دیدم باز ایلاکن کارچی دید احساس خوب داشتم یا پول دیدم خوشبخت شدم پول بسیار زیاد بود من اصلا به خاطر مشکل خانوادگی میگم رقص چیزا میکنم این رقص عربی یا غربی چیزا مثلا والله علاقمند باشم
متاسفانه قاچاق یک تعداد اطفال است که از یک ولایت گرفته میشه به جای دیگه و توسط یک تعداد افراد زورمند اون نگاه میشه و وادار میشه به این کارهایی که بچه بازی بکنه.
دست این کاری مردم از یادم نداده بخیر فکر عاشق از دیدگاه ناخونای یک میخورم بخیر تکلیف عصبی برم پیدا شد.
You know, it's a well tradition amongst Roman emperors as well to have a boy. I forgot the name for it, but
yeah, I know what you mean, because like what's going on here? Like whatever you want to say about the Taliban, they actually they would go out of their way to execute scum that would do that to those kinds of boys. Whatever you want to say about the Taliban, make no mistake, I'm not actually justifying the Taliban here, but that never happened under their regime. That was stomped on.
Hey, you got to give credit where credit is due, and that is true. You know what else too? Believe it or not, the Taliban actually dramatically reduced female genital mutilation during their reign also. So there surprisingly enough was positives. And again, that I would totally withdraw there. It's not a defense of the Taliban, because they're terrible, terrible people. And I definitely, I pray for the people of Afghanistan. But it is interesting to note that even people who we can see as desperately wicked can see that this is desperately wicked. You know what I mean? Now, it's, I got to say though, not to, potentially get you slapped with, I don't know, harassment, bullying, whatever it might be. Sorry, Jamie, is what I'm saying. But this is happening in America with people like Desmond is Amazing, and this whole, and things like Cuties and stuff like that, where they are having 11, 12-year-old boys dress up as little girls and pole dance, right?
Yeah, it's awful.
At gay bars. So like, let's not, I just want to say, while we're bringing this up, right, it is important to point out that this is happening in the United States of America, probably in your local city, if you're being honest.
Yeah, you see, this is why God gave us firing squads.
I got me a gun now, so.
And you know what? Here's the thing too. I'm not liberal with the idea of the death penalty, but I gotta say, I don't know exactly why I need to have taxpayer money going to make a pedophile's life extend. It doesn't make any sense to me, personally. Like, obviously, if anything, I mean, I think that's more worthy of death than murder, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, because like even with murder, right? You might go out of your way to kill someone, but like when it comes to crimes of when it comes to sex crimes, it is essentially removal of the human dignity, because you can kill someone, right? And as heinous as it is, you don't necessarily remove their dignity from them as a person. But when it comes to sex crimes, that's what it involves, actually going out of their way and removing that person's dignity owed to them by virtue of their humanity.
What would you think if pretty much the most logical conclusion to godlessness, if we take it to the kind of sadism and naturalism that comes from the idea that if there's no God, then basically it's the obligation of the strong to exploit the weak for their own pleasure, and that's the rule of the universe essentially, then everything that you're describing here is the literal culmination of that, the children being the most weakest of any society, and then the strong. So it just makes sense, everything that you're seeing, as far, and keep it in mind as far as like when we had a time like the Roman Empire, for example, where like I said, the highest person in the land, it was a normal position to have a boy. I mean, these guys were rich and famous for it, like for and it was just considered I mean, it's not a matter of normalization, because it was so normal anyway. It was never. I don't know how unnormal it was at that time.
Yeah, for instance, a lot of people make the mistake in thinking when Paul says that, how to put it, like he says there are many people that will not enter the kingdom of God. And one thing he says, there will be no drunkard, no liar, no swindler, nor those who defile themselves with mankind, right? The word there is arsenokoitai, and it literally means men who have sex with men in a bed, right? Thing about it is, though, people think that's a reference to homosexuality. It's not, okay? In the culture that Paul is talking about, he is referring to men that will have that rape their lessers. Men that have perhaps other man slaves that rape their lessers.
Corrupter of boys.
Exactly. That is, and in fact, because some of these actions were actually in some way almost expected of Roman aristocracy. For instance, when Emperor Augustus took the throne of Rome, he was actually seen almost as a bit of a pariah in his society, because he was the only one among the nobility that would exclusively have sex with females. And that's because, like, the rape of your lessers is something that was expected of you, whoever that might be. And so when
That's
Paul is
terrible.
yeah, it absolutely is. So when Paul is referring to arsenic coitai, he's not referring to homosexuality as we understand it. He refers to that in Romans 1, but in the context that he is referring to in Corinthians, this is referring to men that have power that are raping their other men that are their lessers, because it was
Let
incredibly
me ask.
Well,
Let me
so
ask
in that
a hard
society.
question then. Let me ask a harder question real quick, CJ, and then you can say whatever. What is this? What does that suggest about, say, people who are abused into that lifestyle? Is there forgiveness for them? I don't know. I wonder. I know there's other texts, of course, but I mean, this is where I have struggle with people who are abused in a very particular way and at a certain age, and you wonder, this is the problem of sin. I mean, I'm not trying to baptize it by any means.
Mhm.
I'm just asking that hard question. Like, how are these people judged? I mean, I'm not sure.
What I will say is that they are under the weight of their share of the responsibility, because nobody sins alone. That being said, the greater sin and the greater guilt will be on the one that had deceived them, that had abused them into that lifestyle.
So there's I think a few things. The first thing I just want to briefly say, because you mentioned Augustus, and Augustus is also somebody I consider a personal hero, because he broke a ton because it was also considered you were supposed to have a whole bunch of concubines and cheat on your wife frivolously. And Augustus decided that he thought that was detestable and that there was nothing stronger than the family unit. And there's a lot of other things like that. Augustus is
You
just
are
like
aware of the
a bizarrely
prescriptions,
good
right?
person.
Sorry,
Say
you are
again.
aware of the prescriptions, right?
Yeah, he was. It's weird because
You
he
say
and he ends
personal
up being, of
hero, and
course,
I
the
mean,
emperor. And like I said, the thing that's interesting about it is he ends up being the emperor even when Jesus is born, right? So it's like it's interesting that this ridiculously ethical leader happens to be the leader when, well, in some ways, he's also obviously very unethical in other ways.
dude, he
But
murdered like thousands of people, like to come into like the prescriptions were pretty detestable, man. Like that
well,
was
and
literally a purge, a political purge of all of his enemies to steal his money. So I definitely wouldn't call him anything that's any kind of hero. I mean, maybe a political hero.
well,
But
see
he's up there with Hitler, as far as I'm concerned.
See, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, though, right? Where it's like, in a way, you kind of have to take things in a little bit more of a context than that, right? Because you look at leaders throughout history, and really there are very few who are even close to as good as Augustus. And that's genuinely a true thing, right? You look at Julius Caesar, you look at any of the Roman emperors, just
That's how we
name the
define
list,
good.
right? Any
I
of the
mean,
pharaohs.
literally made a list of all of his political enemies and had
Yeah,
them
but so did everybody.
had them all slaughtered. So I mean,
Like, who didn't though? You know what I mean? Like, and
well,
that's
didn't.
100%
Well,
literal.
I'm
Like,
just saying
they all did.
the reason you call him good is because he did that more efficiently than everybody else, right?
No, I would call him good for all of the things that he breaks norm with, like his for the aforementioned
The
preservation of the family
law,
unit.
for
So
sure.
okay,
I agree with that.
let's say this. Let's say this. With the how would it? With the whole landscape in consideration, Augustus was more ethical than most. He had his own problems, and most definitely did not, and most definitely was no Christian or Jew. Nonetheless, showed showed people a distinct dignity that most didn't show in that time. And so, what's going on though, and how I kind of want to kind of end this is that how should I say this? Okay, I actually do respect the teachings of Aristotle and Cicero, because it was Aristotelian philosophy that greatly influenced Christian theology. I mean, you can see that everywhere throughout. You can see glimpses of that being in the back of the author's mind of Ecclesiastes. You can see that throughout the New Testament when Paul is bringing up what people know by nature. He's referring to natural law, something that came out from Aristotelian philosophy. And so much of Christian theology that we know today has been informed by Aristotle, okay? That being said, this is a man that had said there are entire populations that are good for nothing else but to be the slaves of Greeks. This is a man that had said that to have value in this world, it took three qualities. It took you being a man first, it took you being a Greek and not a barbarian, and you needed to be human and not a beast. As in, what he was saying is that to have dignity in this world required you to fall into to all three of these categories. If you were missing one, you had no dignity. So that's very disturbing. Meanwhile, with Cicero's contributions greatly essentially culminated in the establishment of American republicanism in his orations, in his legal standards. I have great respect for Cicero at all. Yet this is also a man that made constant use of the anuses of little boys. And moreover, he was quite politically savvy in his own way, and somewhat bloodthirsty in his own right. So, like, here's the thing: I am thankful for the contributions these men have made to our modern society, but let's not mistake, these guys would be very scary dudes if they were to exist today, because they are so like, how should I say this? There is such a gap, such a distance between these men, that the idea of them existing today is as scary as it is baneful to even think about. And so I'm thankful for what they did, for the contributions that they have made to our society, but I'm also thankful that they're dead and they can stay where they are. I would not ever want them here.
See, so, and this is, I think, one area where I would have to push back a little bit, because I don't think that it has so much to do with their own psychology per se as it does with a fundamental fact about human nature. And I would actually say quite boldly that if the four of us lived at that point in time,
we do the same thing, yeah.
To be higher close Rome. Oh, absolutely, right? Until we became Christians. But there's no way that we would be sitting up here thinking, and this is something that Jordan Peterson talks about quite frequently, where he talks about Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and he tries to, explain to people, hey, everybody thinks, no, I wouldn't be the Nazi if I lived in Nazi Germany. But statistically speaking, yeah, you would, like, for sure. That's why there was only like 5 to 10% of all people in the German Reich at that time who weren't actually Nazis, right? Because statistically speaking, you would, and you would, and it scares people. It bothers them that their nature actually could potentially lead them to do something detestable like that, and they have no idea how, right? Because they think to themselves, there's nothing in me that would want to do X, Y, and Z. And yet, for some reason, I think we all kind of know that somewhere deep there, we may not know even what X, Y, and Z is, but it's there. And it's just lurking, being hidden behind luxuries and prosperity and a functioning society.
Yeah,
and
isn't that interesting? They still seem to have an idea of shame. Because I've gone through a lot of Cicero, but I didn't see any open speaking of him enjoying little boys. But I'm not doubting that he did, that there's some evidence of it somewhere. But in him speaking with some others, like, for example, he's speaking about how people didn't use certain words, certain vulgar language in public. So the idea that they still had these morals.
Oh, certainly they did.
Still kept things under the rug, even though they still acknowledged, yeah, these things are shameful. We're still going to do them. We're still going to cover them up, because they pretty much have no reason not to.
Okay,
and
so
it really to where somebody's fundamental moral core is and why they have it.
My point is, Kelvy, is that what we see within the actions of Cicero and Aristotle, I'm not necessarily putting this completely on them. They are products of their own time and culture. And yet that is exactly what I am saying, that these men are like the ethical distance from us and these men can be compared to the genetic difference between Tyrannosaurus Rex and humanity. Because, like, again, a T-Rex is big, it's strong, it's like the apex predator of its time, but you wouldn't want it in your backyard. And in the same thing, as much as I appreciate Cicero and Aristotle, the contributions they've made, and they represent they kind of represent a much more like a predatory age, which no doubt gets a lot of the imaginations running. You wouldn't want these guys on your Senate floor either. And so I'm not putting all of this on them. They are products of their time, but it is specifically because of that culture they come from that I'm thankful they're gone now. I'm thankful that Greek and Roman culture didn't win the day, and that ultimately it was Christian culture and it was Christendom that had won. That had like that had proven itself to be timeless.
See, and I do definitely hear a lot of what you're saying, but I think there's a point here, a greater point that I want to try and hammer home if I can, which is that I think when we look at these kinds of historical societies and even, modern day contemporary societies, and we see all these different things, it's not so much that, I wouldn't want Cicero to be my neighbor, because I believe if Cicero was my neighbor, he wouldn't have acted like Cicero. You know what I mean? Considering all the cultural differences and all that other different kind of stuff. Unless, of course, he's just, from age 45 coming right up to the United States and immigrating, that might obviously be different, but you get my point. If I could switch spots with Cicero, right, statistically speaking, chances are I would act very similar to Cicero and he would act very similar to me.
Correct.
And statistically speaking, you could replace any sort of two individuals there with each other, right? So what I'm saying is, I think that, when we compare, you said it's like a ethical difference from that's comparable to the genetics differences between us and a Tyrannosaurus Rex. But I actually look at it as much more of, it really kind of hammers home the illusion that dogs are not wolves, when really they are, right? And you have wolves in your house, and you like to pretend that you don't have rabid, packing up, savage, kills elks for fun, all that other kind of stuff, wolves in your home that you cuddle with, but you do, right? And that's a matter of scientific fact. And it's all an illusion that dogs aren't actually wolves. That your dog would never turn on you under any circumstances or anything like that, right? In fact, that's the whole reason why good dog trainers tell you have to absolutely be the pack hen, because they will remain loyal to the pack hen. They're animals, right? And so it's sort of just like ingrained in them to do that.
Yeah, it's instinct, of course.
But it's not out of like some innate sense of loyalty. And that's not even to say that your dogs don't care about you. I think that your dogs definitely do care about you, but it's not the same thing as what we think of, right? That's a wolf. I have right now in my house 2 wolves on my couch, and it's a lot more obvious for me because they're huskies. But the point, you know what I mean, is just that, like, these are the same creatures that cause so many problems in Montana and Alberta and where I live here in Idaho and stuff like that. And because their coat's a little different and they're a little smaller and their blue eyes are a lot cuter than the deep brown eyes, there's this illusion that that's not true. That really these ones are better, right? That these ones are somehow more pure and more clean, and they're more moral, and they're loving and loyal in a way that's more human-like rather than wolf-like. But that's all crap. You know what I mean? And in the same way, because we live in a society that's rich and it's wealthy and it's got those are the two things, same things. But what I meant to say is rich monetarily, but then also wealthy as far as abundance, right? We have a lot of stuff. Also, we have obviously a lot of specifically foodstuffs. We're fat. We have a lot of stuff to get drunk with, to get high with, to go out and make ridiculous fancy desserts with. And we can build fancy cars, and we can create gigantic skyscrapers, and we have all this structure around us that makes it to where you can't do this, that, or the other thing because you wrote on a piece of paper some symbols, and that means something, right? For some reason. And if you think about it, like, how absurd is that this collection of symbols on a piece of paper for some reason means you can't do the thing that you very obviously can go do physically, right? but we're so used to that, we're so accustomed to that, that those kind of thoughts aren't things that we really think of anymore. But if the situation was a little different, right, then that wouldn't be the case. If we didn't have cops on every corner, or if the money all of a sudden wasn't buying the bread, or the bread sucked and it wasn't really feeding us properly, things get a lot different, and they get a lot different real quick. And you don't even have to leave the country to figure that out. Just go to Portland or Los Angeles. You know what I mean? And so, while I appreciate your point as far as, the ethical differences in Christianity winning out and how we should be very thankful for Christian culture and its influence, I totally appreciate that point. I also want to point out that really what the evil things that Cicero and Augustus and all these other really good people from the past did, meaning good from our human perspective, we look at them as being good from the lens of history, right? The fact that they were so detestable and that was just okay, to me, that proves more about the just absolute facade that is good people in structured, ordered society, more than it does.
Let me play this for you guys, because this is very much to the point. I'll just play a brief excerpt from here, and then you guys can respond.
It was going to become a big point for me. But I started studying genocide mostly because I didn't want to be disqualified from somebody looking at me and saying, you're getting God out of the problem of evil by not taking evil seriously. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, I don't want anybody to be able to disqualify me on going, you didn't look at how bad this really is. So I started studying genocide. And then for some reason, I kept going. And as I kept studying genocide, I think I was reading Iris Chang's book, The Rape of Nanking, which is about Japan's invasion of Nanking, China in 1937. And in that book, Iris Chang talks about that the Japanese raped or tortured or murdered 300,000 people. And Iris Chang writes that the soldiers went beyond rape to slice off women's breasts, to nail them alive to walls, that fathers were forced to rape their daughters and sons, their mothers, as other family members watched. And as I kept reading genocide books, I began to realize this is just simply something that humans do. This is what humans do. They do genocide very easy. And one more major point about that is every genocide researcher I've ever read, and I've read a lot of them, and I have said this to thousands of people, tens of thousands of people now probably heard me say this. I've said every genocide researcher I've ever read, to a person, there are no exceptions, and every genocide victim I've ever read, and I've read a lot of the victims' own words, every single one of them agreed, without exception, that it's the average member of a population that commits genocide. Every one of them. Elie Wiesel absolutely does. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, all of them do. Now, if you take that serious, in fact, there's a book that I've assigned to my classes entitled Ordinary Men. The subtitle is Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland. And in that book by Christopher Browning, he concludes, I could have been the killer or the evader. Both were human. There's something really wrong with humankind. And then I always bring it back into abortion. You know that here in the United States, of course, we have suction scraped or scalded to death over 60 million babies. Suction scraped or scalded to death. I like to emphasize that. Over 60 million babies. You know, people talk about the old practice, that was gone on in England of being drawn and quartered, where they would tie people to, after they'd hang somebody, they would tie their legs and arms to horses and pull them apart.
Which was supposedly more humane, because the person was already dead.
Well, the person was already dead. Yeah. That's one of the amazing things about it. But if you look up being drawn and quartered, I don't think you'll ever find one article that won't call that barbaric. That's the word. Barbaric will be in every single article on that. But here it is when it comes to abortion, we're suctioning the legs and arms off of children while they're alive. Who keeps that legal? Who keeps abortion legal? It's your neighbors, right? It's your coworkers, right? And I like to look at audience and say, maybe it's you, but there's something wrong. And then when it comes to the way we see, we see people commit adultery in their hearts, and we go, and when they think because they don't actually do it, then we go, well, see, he's a good person. No, the reason they're not doing it is out of self-interest. I don't want her to get pregnant or, whatever. That's why they're not doing it. Similarly, if you hate somebody, why don't you kill them? Well, it's not because you care for the person, because we've already established that you hate their guts. So why don't you kill them? Well, it's self-interest, right? I've seen those guys in the prison population, and I don't want to be in there with them. I mean, but see, when you do it, or when you actually commit adultery, or when you actually kill somebody, is when you think you found a workaround to get rid of all the consequences. I think I can do this without getting caught. But see, we have a society full of adulterous murderers, and we're going, well, because they're not doing it, they're actually good people. It has nothing to do, zero to do with human goodness. And when you tie that again then into genocide, people are not good. And this is, I'm one more thing.
Yeah, I've got a quote from you too. It's a really good one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the quote is, "The majority of any culture that participates in mass killings will always find a way to justify their killing."
Yeah. And when it comes to abortion, I had a woman come up to me when I very first started writing and teaching on this, and she said, "Clay," she says, "man, the stuff you talk about genocide, that really makes your point." She says, "But don't talk about abortion because it weakens your point, because most people don't think abortion is wrong, and so it weakens your point." And I thought, well, that's my point. It's our killing. Our killing's okay, but boy, do we get upset when the Germans do it, or the Khmer Rouge does it, or what's going on in Rwanda. I mean, every nation, it seems like, at one time or another embarks on mass killing, but they always find a way to justify it and then point their fingers at others.
Yeah, and I would say too, I have, in fact, the reason I call myself the synagogue, well, part of it obviously is the synagogue, right? Because that whole thing, and I am ethnically Jewish, and so there's that little pun there. But the cynic part of the reason I chose that is not just because I happen to think Antisthenes and other Greek cynics were really great philosophers, although I do, but it was part of this, wanting to hammer home to people that we have this really bizarre worldview and I think it's bizarre, at least. It makes no sense to me, where we think that like people are they really want to do the right thing and they really care for other individuals. And we all have this ability to go out and achieve stuff, and those achievements are worth something. And really, it's just like that. It's just so odd in light of the human experience. You know what I mean? And I say this really briefly, removing God from the equation, because of course that's the thing that makes everything different, right? But when you consider, like, for example, people will ask, like, "Oh, do you believe that everybody has a soulmate?" And just sometimes a little part of me dies inside, this little cynic that says, yeah, no, totally, that 8-year-old kid who just got fucking gang raped, excuse my French, but this stuff does irritate me a lot, gang raped in South Africa because he had the audacity to walk outside while his mom wasn't watching, and a whole group of detestable, disgusting, AIDS-ridden junkies were outside, right? And they just happened to think that this would be a fun thing to do, and then they threw him in a fire and he died. Yeah, no, he had a soulmate for sure, right? That makes sense. No, that's just, and when you start to think of things in that perspective, it's just so weird to think like you deserve a person or a meaningful existence, or people will talk about like a I don't think that my employer pays me a reasonable wage. Like, what exactly is a reasonable wage? Are you starving? Because most people are starving, so like, shut the hell up. You know what I mean? Like, literally. And it's just so weird to me to hear people have this view of this view of like being entitled to stuff, that life is good, that things are actually all moving for the better, that everybody really actually deep down cares for their fellow man, and that all your achievements are worthwhile and you actually have the capacity to achieve them no matter what you do, and all this other kind of stuff is just, I don't know. It irks me. Like, it's annoying to me.
What you're describing, CJ, are in fact the culmination of Christian assumptions. Because, while yes, I would agree that here's the thing. This is why I don't see as evolution as being in any way, shape, or form contrary to the Christian worldview. Because what we see out in nature, the survival of the fittest, is simply God's creation without God in it. That's why human civilization is so important, and especially Christian civilization, because the whole idea that like, again, because you're right, there's really no reason for thinking you should have any rights at all, or anybody should be valued for any reason, right? Like there is no reason why you should go about your life thinking that men and women are equal at all, because practically speaking, they suck at everything. They suck at war. You can work them to death far easier than men. They die earlier than men. They're not as strong. They're not as strong as men. But by and large, with all things practically speaking, women are clearly the inferior gender. So why do we even assume they have any value at all? Well, the reason we do that is because there is a holy God that says they have value. It is these Christian assumptions that we carry with us that tell us that, like for instance, CJ, it really bothers you when a little boy gets gang raped in South America. Why? Like, why should that bother you at all? Well, it bothers you because there are Christian assumptions that you are operating with that tells you that's wrong, and so there are people that think people have value because there are Christian assumptions operating within them. And so, what you are describing, CJ, and again, this is where you and I might disagree, but I think I think it really does hammer the point home. People commit genocide because they honestly think it is a good. They don't go out of their way to commit evil for the sake of evil. Nobody is Sauron. Nobody does that. People try to pursue their own good, and without God, that culminates in evil. And so, how you respond to this is you be thankful for for Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and spread his civilization as far as you can humanly take it to, and keep preaching it. Because the more you do that, the more that these values that you see as I wouldn't say you see them as superfluous, but these values that you question as to why we have them begins to form more the reality. Like, because there's no reason why we should have a thought that black people shouldn't be our slaves if it weren't for the fact that the pale Galilean, the Christ that was crucified on the cross, was constantly pricking our consciences, telling us this is a terrible thing. That's the issue. That's what you're seeing there. Why? So the reason that you're so bothered by this is because there is a Christian civilization that informs your morality, that informs your conscience, and that's why it needs to be spread the world over.
See, and I do definitely agree with a lot of that, but I also think, there's obviously some points I think of disagreement. One thing I will say that it just in brief agreement and extension is part of the result of my own cynicism is definitely an extreme thankfulness. Because, like the aforementioned absurdity of the idea of soulmates makes me incredibly thankful that I'm a married person, and I got married at the age of 20 to somebody that I really wanted to be married to and still really enjoying being married to. And that's like, in the grand scheme of things, that is just not something that you're guaranteed for a whole litany of reasons, and all of them are terrible, right? And so likewise with being able to achieve any sort of my goals, or being able to have any sort of a prosperity, or having a loving family, or any of that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Like, it's in other words, the kind of pointlessness of it all, in a way, and the fleetingness of it all. And it's funny because this ends up being the ultimate message of Ecclesiastes, actually. But is in a sense something that gives it a lot of value, and especially when you know that it's it is something that is actually a gift that was given by a gift giver, right? You have a family because somebody had some children, namely the Lord, and he decided to give you those children as your wife and kids and father and so on and so forth, right? And he didn't have to, for various different reasons. Now, where I think I might disagree in a couple things is, number one, I do believe that, and it's weird because there's some nuance in a way. You say nobody wants to do evil for evil purposes, and in a sense, I agree with that. because I had the caricature earlier of Adolf Hitler as Darth Sidious, and of course that was sarcastic and mocking, and I did it on purpose because it is kind of ridiculous to think of him as like a cartoon character, like he wasn't a human person that was just the same as UI or some other guy. You know what I mean? But at the same time, there, and this is going to sound like a weird argument, but I think that you'll definitely see where I'm going with this, right? I think one only has to look at, the movies playing at your local movie theater or what comes on your radio to see that, I think people kind of like evil. It's fun for them. The extreme sexualization of girls, or the idea, there's references to adultery in every single rap and pop song on the radio. The essential worship of female promiscuity, of greed, love of money, right? I'll do all these things like murder you and beat you up, and it'll be me and all my friends, and we're not going to fight you fair, and all this other kind of stuff. You know what I mean? And people just put that on the radio while their 4-year-olds in the back. And later on that weekend, they'll go pay $10.50 each to eat food while they watch the local torture porn flick, Saw 57 or whatever's coming out these days. And they think it's different than going to the gladiatorial rings because it's actors. But really what's going on is you just paid money to go and even eat food, for crying out loud, while you watch human beings be tortured and cry out in agony and terror and all this other kind of stuff, right?
And so I'll let you. I'm sorry. I'll let you finish first, then I'll respond.
Well, yeah, and then I'll get to the point, because the point is just to say that it kind of makes me think that I don't know if anybody thinks of themselves as doing evil for evil, but I do think that people know that they do evil for evil, and that almost is a turn on for them in a way, not necessarily a sexual turn on, although it can be. It depends on obviously what your particular kick is, I guess. But it's almost like the badder it is, the better it is. You know what I mean?
And there's certainly a truth to that. There are people do like to be kind of sensationalized in that kind of way. But at the same time, CJ, you are kind of ignoring the big elephant in the room, I would say. While it is true that people will pay like $10.25 each to watch Saw, I guarantee you nobody will pay money to watch actual human beings be actually murdered. Because again, like as much as there's the faults you see in our society, which I would agree with you, there are quite the legitimate amount of faults in it. They nonetheless are overshadowed by a Christian understanding of the world. Because in Rome, you weren't hearing and looking at plays of people being murdered. No, you were actually paying money to see people being eaten and murdered. So again, even though you're right in everything you're saying, what you're saying still is overshadowed by by the huge apparatus of Christianity that sees people as having dignity. Now, what you're seeing, I would say, kind of does illustrate my point a little bit here, because when people are when people are doing this, when they're going out of their way to see the movie Saw and kind of in a sense make female promiscuity a sense of idolatry, they nonetheless are pursuing what they see to be their good. That the idea of female promiscuity, this thing that is their god, is nonetheless them seeking after what they perceive to be their good. Problem about that is that when they try to achieve a good without God, that good becomes evil. Hence the need to preach the gospel, to prick the consciences with the cause of Christ. Because what's going on, Jamie? To put this in perspective. One, I think I already did, because although we pay money to see, as you would say, torture porn in a movie, right? The Romans would pay actual money to see actual torture porn. That's the difference. Whereas today, our entertainment, we get our jollies out of the understanding that this is fantasy. The Romans took it a step further. They didn't want fantasy; they wanted the real thing. So in that way, I would say we are still ethically speaking, far superior to what we replaced. Now, I think there is clearly a line of demarcation where we're losing our ethics. I would agree with you on that. But moreover to the point, in spite of this, you can still clearly see a Christian civilization that is pricking the consciences of very, very very worldly people, because they are the heirs to this Christian civilization. And so what Christians everywhere have the obligation to do is to announce to the heirs, this is the civilization that you've come from. This is what you are responsible for upholding. And the more you do that, the more that you make people aware of where they are at within the cosmos, within the cause of Christ, the more the cause of Christ will return more powerful than ever. And until we do that, what you are criticizing, CJ, it's not going to go away, because criticizing it to whine and complain about it, yeah, you're right, it's there, but it's not going to stop being there unless like we do something about it. And Christ told us what to do about it, to preach his crucified body. And if we do that, his power will be shown within Christendom all the more fuller.
Well, so I think there's one point that I do want to kind of correct real quick, because it's not that I disagree with you as far as Christian societies, kind of nullify these problems in certain ways, or make them better, or sometimes make them even appear to go away. In fact, I would say that everything that I believe, as far as, because essentially in a lot of ways, obviously I've applied the title cynic to myself, but there's a lot of nihilism and dare I say fatalism, if some people are watching, involved in a lot of the stuff I say. That was a joke, but I'm sure certain people get it. But regardless,
you filthy heretic! How dare you! I condemn you to heck, eternal heck.
Eternal heck fire.
That's the one where they do stuff that's unspeakable.
Now, what I will say, CJ, I think you and I can have a very intelligent conversation here, but admittedly, I do find your views of like divine determinism a little bit fatalistic, at least from my perspective. You might see it differently, but I'm just coming up. I'm just like but I'm just spilling my own opinion out there.
Well, yeah, so yeah, and I'll say respectfully, I don't necessarily I would never use the word fatalist to describe myself, but I'm not offended that people consider me to be fatalistic, because I think when you look at what the idea of fatalism is saying at its core, right, not in its full-fledged philosophical, whatever the word is,
realization.
Yeah, realization. There you go. Thank you. But if you just look at the sort of core of the claim, which is that, things that are going to happen are fated to happen, and in a sense are inevitable. I do definitely believe that, if I'm being honest with myself, and it's hard for me to not believe that. That being said, I do take the position that there are, and it's kind of you have to take a couple steps back, but I don't want to get too deep into it, just because I want to continue on the conversation we're having real quick. But just to kind of briefly explain, I think that humans do everything that they freely wish to do, and I guess it is relevant to what we're talking about. Everything that they freely wish to do, but the things that we freely wish to do aren't really that great. That we kind of suck, you know what I mean? And so, in a sense, that's how I kind of jive the idea of compatibilism, right? In that there does appear to be a sense of predestination, but also the will is just as free as any other will is. It's just bound by its own nature. Now, that sort of view of human nature then, of course, bleeds into what we're talking about here, right? Because it's not that I disagree with you as far as, preach the gospel. It changes people on an individual level and also societies, which is something we've definitely seen manifested throughout history. I would agree with that, but I think my point is to kind of try and pull back the facade for a moment so people kind of remember why exactly that this is important in the first place. Because when people don't remember why it's important, and I'm not saying that you're doing this, right? But when people don't remember that this kind of stuff is important, then you do have things like, because we have the Saw example, right? And we say, well, people wouldn't go pay to go watch, something happen in the gladiatorial ring, right? And everybody's, yeah, no, I think that's right. And I kind of don't, if I'm being honest. Like, I think if somebody started opening it up, I mean, and let me just speak a little bit from personal experience, having lived in a relatively ghetto area, right? I've definitely been in some rings, if you will. They're not really rings, right? Because it's not like there's anything official going on, but where I could have seen someone die, for sure. Nobody did, but it could have happened. Fight Club is real in a sense, not when you get to the end of the movie, but those middle portions of the movie, like, that's a thing that happens, right? Or Michael Vick dogfighting clubs, also, and so you start to ask the question. I mean, would people really not show up? Now, of course, enter the gospel into my life, and that's not something I would even think about. I don't even really like watching MMA, although I have a lot of appreciation for martial arts. But I just don't like seeing people in pain anymore, right? There's nothing fun or pleasing to me about it. And so that your point is completely taken there as far as the gospel's ability to change, right? But I just want to hammer home to people this idea that, like, when we say that people are, that they're good, I think it kind of it feeds into this, I think, facade, if I'm just being honest about it, that is really only a result of the systems around us more than it is our actual nature. Now, granted, of course, if you have a collection of actual Christians together, then the nature there, in a sense, the nature of the society, you could say, in a sense, is going to tend towards a Christian direction. But each of those individual Christians is only going to tend in that direction because of their own realization that their nature is detestable, which I think all of us in this room would probably agree that our own personal nature is detestable. Otherwise, we probably would not have confessed Christ, right? But so I hope that kind of explains a little better as far as, like, what exactly I'm trying to get at, right? As far as our disagreement with the point of, are humans good or not good? I would say that it's not that I disagree that we have, Christian societies that improve, or preaching the gospel that changes the individual, or, a holiness lifestyle that definitely, it's obviously, it's not like a prosperity gospel kind of thing, but holiness does lead to prosperity. It's just a matter of fact, right? Like, those who don't commit adultery or get divorced tend to be more financially wealthy, just as a matter of statistical fact. And so, you definitely have a lot of truth there, but I'm just trying to say that, I don't know if it's as much of a change on the society-wide level, or at least it in anymore today, as we'd like to think. You know what I mean? And the last thing I'll say here is just this. You know what I mean? When I talk about things like going to fighting rings or dog fighting rings or stuff like that, I mean, I don't know what areas you guys live in, but if they happen to be cities, or if you're near the cities in your state, you could go find, but you could easily go find these, because when I was finding them, I was a 12-year-old kid. You know what I mean? And it's not like they were very hidden. And some of the people there were definitely involved in law enforcement. And we're just sitting there watching people potentially kill each other. Who knows? It could happen. I don't know. Some of these guys are on, crystal meth while they're in the middle of the fight. But anyways, I'm rambling now.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but here's the difference, though, because again, prize fights definitely happen in Rome. Do you think they never betted over the gladiators? Of course they did. In fact, we have archaeological proof that's exactly what they did. The difference is that when the Romans did this, they did this with the understanding, with the intention that someone was going to bleed and die, because it's not just the defeat of the person that they were after. They were legitimately after seeing someone bleed and die on the sandy floor. And again, like even the prize fights you saw, and as much as I would disagree, and as much as that is morally reprehensible, these prize fights that you have seen, and you probably know people that were a part of, they never went into the ring to kill the other guy. They went into the ring to stop, to hit him until he stopped. That was the whole point. Till someone's defeated, not until someone's killed. Now, death might result out of as of an unintended consequence of the sport. The same thing happened when like medieval knights went jousting together. They might have jousted, and you know what? Some of their lances might have broken and actually cut someone's throat open. That actually happened, where two knights were actually lancing together. One guy's lance kind of slipped out of the way and just impaled this guy in his throat, and he died choking on his own blood. That wasn't the intention of the sport, though. The intention of the sport was to knock someone off their horse. And so again, this is the distance between Rome and us and the West. Where in the West, when we engage in violent sports, it's not with the intention to actually murder, kind of defeat, right? That's the intention. It's to take the other guy, throw him down, see yourself as victorious, and go no further. With Rome, they wanted to see that bloodlust. Now, I will grant with you this, CJ. The idolatry of kind of like a blood sport, like what we see in movies, is a little bit concerning to me. I'm not going to lie. Yet the fact that we see that we've made that an idolatry rather than actual death in and of itself also speaks to just the incredible power that Christianity still has over the world. And I would not want to see it wane, hence why we preach the gospel. But moreover, actually, to kind of illustrate this one point, I want to actually kind of share this. Can I share something, Jamie?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I have your permission then. I'm going to share that. Everyone can see?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, it's on screen. I see it too.
I would ask Tom this, and this is a surprising question, maybe.
Great interview.
For me, just one thing that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel, some analogy in previous and in other civilizations. One novelty, one innovation in thinking about anything, ethical, metaphysical, anything you like. And I must say, I've racked my brains over this often enough, and I cannot think of one. I would love to hear if there is one.
Do you accept that challenge? Absolutely. I think the ideal of lifelong matrimony, I think that's a very distinctive Christian concept. I think the category of what by the 19th century is coming to be categorized as homosexuality and heterosexuality, I think they have no precedence. I think the notion of secularism, the idea of there being religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the concept of science as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something that Christians share with Jews, but that is it gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates to. So I think that all of those are, and essentially what I'm talking in giving that is I am talking about what makes Western civilization distinctive. And one of the things that absolutely makes Western civilization distinctive, and it's an inheritance of its Christian past, is its assumption that its values are universal. This has been fundamental to the way that Christians have understood their faith, that it is for all of humanity. And to this day, the heirs of that cultural tradition want to believe that their values
See, and again, I would even have a lot of agreement with that, right? And you know, to the point of, I think, you know, agreeing with the point I think you really want to drive at, which is our preaching of the gospel does change our societies, right? I would totally affirm that. And obviously this is from a more, you know, Protestant perspective, but I do listen to a lot of Douglas Wilson, who actually argues a lot of the same things. So, you know, it's not even something that's necessarily, you know, outside of my daily listening per se, right? Or I guess weekly listening. I wouldn't say I listen to Doug or anybody daily. But regardless, I just think that, so, because to me, what I see when, and it's not that what you see is somehow not accurate. That's not what I'm trying to say, right? But I'm just saying what I see when I look at these Saw movies, or, you know, the illegal fighting rings, or, you know, dog fighting rings where you are expecting to see death. To me, it's like that step. It's just a wee little push forward, you know, like, because I could easily imagine a scenario where, you know, hypothetically we're all just not so pleasant people, right? And we're going to the fights, and so is everybody else. And this week somebody died, and 6 weeks from now somebody died, and a couple weeks after that somebody died, and by the end of the year, you know, about 6 to 7 people have been killed. But they keep showing up, right? And all of a sudden death is it's a little bit more acceptable each time that people keep coming back. You know what I mean? And it may not even take 6 or 7 times, if we're being honest. I mean, it may only take a couple times of actually accepting it for people to be like, all right, well, this is just what happens at the sport. And you can even see small examples of that in things that I think are relatively benign. Like, for example, football. I totally watch football. I'm not saying football is sinful. But it is interesting. You go to ESPN, you know, your Sports Center on Monday, and they got the big hits cam, right? And after some dude just floored some other guy, potentially gave him a concussion and a spinal injury, right? This guy gets up and takes off his helmet and talks about how much of a savage he is, and starts bragging in the camera about how, you know, he's this amazing lion stud of a guy because he just was able to concuss a fellow human being, right? And then we play that over and over and over again on Sports Center on Monday. And that is even an example that I don't even think is necessarily sinful per se, right? Because in the end, I think there's definitely a lot of fun to be had in contact sports like football and lacrosse and stuff like that. That's not meant to be violent, right? But the fact is that even the fact that you can see it in that kind of a competition, to me, kind of demonstrates it's like we're just so razor's edge close to the and keep in mind when I say facade, it's not a facade that let me rephrase this because I'm getting kind of tired, so I'm not wording my words correctly. But it's not that the Christian morality itself is a facade or that it changes people as a facade, right? But the facade is that people start to believe that this is how we are, rather than this is how we've been made by this outside source, the gospel, which of course is God.
Right.
And then that's where I think you start to see people start to say things like, you know, you start to have like entitlement perspective, or start to have this opinion that, well, all the things I've listed before. I don't want to just ramble on.
That's where the foundation of the morality comes in. I remember after becoming a Christian and like somebody dragging me to a bar, and the first time I kind of looked around, I was like, well, you know, what the hell am I doing here? And then, you know, I remember it striking me for the first, like back in the day, if I didn't, for example, get a phone number or something like that, I would have felt like a loser. Like that became basically this superficial foundation for everything I was doing in that particular moment. But there was no reason not to do that. So it's I would say that it's kind of like the human will, like gravity and water. It's always just going to find the path of least resistance to fulfill its own desire, whatever it happens to be, unless there's a foundation for something that's never going to change, which being the gospel, you know, because if we base if we base our morality on something that's like so the most superficial thing, our stomach, or our sex life, that sort of thing. So people, without a God, they may still decide on another thing in order to in order to get out of that animalistic sense. So that's where they turn to politics, and then they would kill over that, or die over that, or they pick family or something like that, some foundational thing that they can call truth, and then that they can accuse other people. That's where it comes down to that old cosmic justice thing as well, is like, okay, if I've now decided I'm right, and then this is a universal truth which I must spread. And then that becomes and if somebody gets that in their mind, man, they're dangerous.
Well, yeah, no, that's exactly what happened in Nazi Germany. Because the one thing I will agree with CJ here, the rejection of Christian culture and Christianity fundamentally is possible, and it culminates in two ways. With cultures that have no conception of Christianity, say the Far East nations, or Islam, or in this case, Rome and Greece, or in the more recent example, Nazi Germany, when Christianity is either rejected or has no conception of. The brutality we've seen in Nazi Germany and the Roman Empire, that essentially rules the day. Essentially, the limit on human passions as being able, because again, I would say that humans, by virtue of being animals, right? Violence is in fact in our DNA, it's in our instincts. And so what we see throughout human history is that these instincts are thoroughly wielded against, well, your enemies. I mean, that's what happened during the rape of Nanking with Nazi Germany, with the Roman Empire.
I would even argue, if you look at the accounts of the brutality of, for example, Eastern Europe during World War II. I mean, it wasn't just Germany, but look at the reactions of the people there versus the brutality of people in China and Japan, and people don't like to hear it, but because I would say those people, the brutality was still just as brutal. Don't get me wrong, but the reaction of the people in the Christian areas of the Christian traditions were more like, this is absolutely like the people were clearly more like
disturbed.
Yeah, as opposed to just rampant. Because if you look at like for example, like submarine warfare in the Japanese Sea, like there was no prisoners taken from the get-go. Where about in the Atlantic Ocean with Germans versus, like, there was always this kind of, well, at least at first there was. I mean, eventually it just got so out of hand that they couldn't have any quarter, but there was always
I'll correct you on that. On the German-Russian side, that basically deconstructed. But as far as American and German forces, they always treated each other with quite the amount of dignity.
Yeah, until there was one. Well, I know there was one incident that finally happened where they were both like, "Okay, nobody be nice to anybody again," because it's like, but you look in the Asian areas, and there was none of that. And I would completely say that that's because of this recognition that even like these Russians and these Germans at least somehow had some in the back of their mind some idea of the gospel,
exactly. That's the issue, and that's what the point I was kind of coming to, because like during the rape of Nanking, what was going on is that the Japanese soldiers actually had contests, which how many people they could they basically like had contests going on. They would stack people in these great lines, and the idea is, how many people can you behead within this time limit? And they
probably
essentially
no
made
different than the Romans did to the Gauls. No different.
Yeah, they made games out of it. This was something that was supposed to be exalted, praiseworthy, and that's kind of the difference. Because in the West, when genocides happen, you get one of two reactions. They are either ignored or condemned. They are either ignored because of their shame or condemned because of their brutality. When it happens in the non-Christian world, when it happens in Asia, in like Rome, Greece, when it happened in the Nazis, they were not like really ashamed of any of this. They never really tried to ignore it, nor did they really ever condemn it. This was something that they were praising themselves over. and that's kind of like that's the thing, because like when England committed a mass famine on Ireland in the 17th century, and then committed a similar famine on India in the 19th century. These two these two events of history are largely ignored by England because it causes them great shame. Now, meanwhile, when we committed what is tantamount to ethnic cleansing on our indigenous populations here in America, we carry a certain guilt and burden over that to the point where if you look at Indian reservations, we basically give those descendants an incredible amount of liberty that our own citizens don't have. And so you can see that. And so and that's why I want to agree with CJ. There comes a time where you can reject Christianity in the most fundamental levels. And what I would say there is that and what I want to say is that it is possible, but I don't think we are there yet in our society. In fact, I think like all things considered, I think maybe I'm being a little bit more, I don't know, maybe I'm being a bit naive here, but when I take the pulse of the culture, I think there's a good seedbed for a essential renaissance of Christianity in a way.
I kind of see it potentially going either way, to be honest with you. I have a very low view of human nature, but I have a very high view of the gospel. So it kind of creates this, anything can happen kind of perspective.
Myself, and I guess that's where we would fundamentally disagree, CJ, because I have a high degree of both. It's just how are you framing human nature? Because if you're going to frame human nature apart from God, you can have a high view all you want. It's never going to be anything other than wicked, because it's trying to operate apart from the love of God. So and I said, and this is where Aquinas says. Aquinas says that humans are good. We don't go about our day trying to commit evil for evil's sake. It's just that without the goodness of God informing our own, all of our goodness is nothing but evil because it lacks God. Again, Stalin and Hitler both were looking for good, but because neither had God, and one openly rejected God fundamentally in every conceivable manner, good was not done in their nations.
But it's interesting in what you're saying before with the natural ability to recognize, in talking about Caesar's stuff earlier, I'm sure you're familiar with the Gallic War story, where at some point they had one of the cities under siege and they were starving to death, and at some point the people in the city sent out the women and the children to the Romans, somehow hoping for some sort of mercy. And they wrote about this, or Caesar's guy wrote about this happening. Like, this is something that happened where they expected mercy for some reason this is a pre-Christian era. And so you still had this innate idea. And I think that comes from just the idea of, it's kind of talked about in Job, where, even if we're animalistic, human beings all have experienced some sort of nurturing through having a mother, having that sort of tenderness that everybody knew as a child in some way, and now how long that lasts is a whole other story. But yeah,
that's not what they were trying to do. They didn't send the women and children out for the hopes that they would have some kind of mercy. You could say that's
yeah, okay, yeah.
You could say that's what they were trying to do, but specifically they were trying to stop
They were also starving themselves too. Yeah.
No. So the reason they sent the women and children out is because they were sending them out to be raped by the Romans, so that the Romans might not burn the city to the ground.
Here's a question.
I don't agree with that interpretation. I mean, I know that interpretation, but they were all actually starving. So I don't think they were expecting a bunch of starving soldiers to rape their women.
Could this be the state of the world before Christ returns?
No, actually, I wouldn't say that, Jimmy. This is the state of the world as it is without God. And again, that's why I have no problem accepting like evolution, where CJ might, because evolution, the idea that there's the survival of the fittest, that the strong have the right to dominate the weak, and that the weak basically just die in shit and squalor. That is the state of the world without God in it. And so it is through God's goodness that informs us that we can come into the world and make it a better place, where the law of nature is not where the law of nature is not ruling us, but we rule over nature. So like what I'm saying, this is not the state of the world before Christ comes. This is the state of the world as it has always been, without God in it and ruling directly over it. Does that make sense?
I can agree with that in the sense that it's I would take it as the fall, but yeah, I think the notion is definitely true. That is what's happening. It's I wouldn't take a view of evolution like a common ancestor view. I mean, I
Right.
don't.
Oh yeah, I understand theologically you can be on board with that. What I'm explaining to you is why, personally, for me, with my own understanding of Christianity, whether evolution is true or not. Well, let's
I agree. Yes, I agree there.
Let's make the argument it's true. It rather kind of, if evolution is true, it rather proves Christianity all the more, rather than be any antagonistic enemy against it.
Yeah, you come to the same circumstance. You could come to that circumstance. Yeah, that
as a Catholic, you don't. You're the Catholic kind of eschatology is just sort of eventually just more dominionism, right? It versus like if I think at some point just all of this stuff is just gonna go. But as far as like the Book of Revelation and the wrath and all that kind of stuff, a Catholic, they think that all that stuff's already happened, right? So you don't really have this sort of this future idea of some ultimate accumulation of everything. Like you think it's something is going to have to inevitably just kind of settle down, right?
No, again, it comes to understanding a prophecy, because like prophecy has a direct context in which it is being written. For instance, when Daniel's being written, it has a more direct context to Daniel's day, but it also has a remoter context in the conquest of Jerusalem by the Greeks and later in the Romans. And so that's how prophecy works. There is like the direct context in which the author is writing, but then there's a remoter context, like for a second fulfillment of the same prophecy. For instance, the beast in John's day, when he's writing Revelation, it was the Roman Empire, because he calls it like the city sitting on 7 hills, and ancient Rome in his day was literally sitting on 7 hills on the eastern side of the Tiber River. And later on, what he's saying is that there is a man who is the beast. Now, the number of the beast is 666. Now, because John is using Greek gematria, we know that 666 it means Nero Caesar, because essentially what gematria says is that each number has a linguistic meaning, and when you take 666, translate it through Greek gematria, you get Nero Caesar. So the beast of Revelation, in John's day is Caesar, specifically Nero. That is his context. Now, what he's saying is that there is going to be a fulfillment later on of another beast, right? That still has yet to come. And so it's a perfect example of how God's prophecy works. On one hand, it has a direct fulfillment in the day it's written, but on the other hand, there are more remoter contexts, which is why I don't subscribe to this idea that Christianity is going to be the one world religion that everybody's going to follow. I'm of the opinion that the beast system is going to follow more of what John saw in his day, that Christian culture, Christian civilization will one day disappear, and it will be replaced by something more comparable to that of Rome than anything we would recognize today.
You understand it to be Rome, absolutely, because of Daniel, right? I mean, I just find it interesting that you're insisting that, and then I agree. I think the last system will be a Roman system. But we should talk about that later, obviously. So CJ, you go ahead, and then everybody give their final comments, because I'm going to lay down here to want to shut it down. But feel free to take your time for whatever you want to say. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Well, I'm gonna. Yeah, and definitely thank you a lot, and thank you guys also for having the conversation. I might do a live stream tomorrow. I know everybody's going to want to watch the Super Bowl and stuff, but it's like at 9:00 at night, so I could probably get away with doing something. And if I do, Fro, you should stop by, because I got a lot I want to say on what
I should
you
stop.
just said.
I should stop what?
Try and stop by if possible.
Okay. Well, I have work tomorrow. I don't know if I could.
For sure. Yeah, and we should definitely talk more about that, because it's another one of those things, right, where there's a lot of things that I agree with and a lot of things I don't. But I think a discussion on Book of Revelation, especially considering our aforementioned commitments to Reformed Protestantism and traditionalist Catholicism, I think that'd be a good conversation if you're interested. But with that, I just would kind of end with shalom and God bless, and thank you very much for having me here, and everybody else. And also, good to see you again, Kelby. I feel like it's been a while since I've actually talked to you, because I haven't done an open room in like 3 months. But nonetheless, nice to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. Likewise.
All right. Okay, so I don't got much to say, except that I am very thankful that the civilization we live in is Christendom. I am thankful that we don't have to. I'm thankful that through the crucified Christ, we have a dignity that the world had never known before him. And what I would want to say is that I agree with CJ in the sense that who we are as instinctual beings can easily see the erosion of this culture. And that's why I want to do everything I can with the Pale Galilean as a way of perpetuating it further, as a way of keeping it alive, however small way I can. And I'll be very interested to pop by if I can, CJ. And for that, I guess I have nothing to say other than Viva Cristo Rey and pray the rosary.
Yeah. Good night, folks.
All right, guys. Good night. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. I'll see you guys all soon. And I'm just going to end with reading the verse. But Christ being come and high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctified to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And for this cause he is the mediator of the New Testament, that by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament, they which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. God bless. Good night.